She walked out of that courtroom with nothing. No settlement, no alimony, no attorney fees, just the clothes on her back and the rain soaking straight through them. Every person in that building thought Vivian Hawthorne had finally been broken. 10 years of marriage erased in 40 minutes by a man who never deserved a single one of them. Her ex-husband stood on those courthouse steps grinning like he'd won a war. He had no idea he'd just made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. If you want to see how completely one woman dismantles an empire, like this video, drop your city in the comments and don't you dare look away. The rain came down like it had a grudge. It hammered the marble steps of the Harlow County Courthouse in sheets so thick that the crowd gathered under the overhang couldn't tell where the sky ended and the street began. October in New York had that particular cruelty to it. The kind that didn't just make you cold, but made you feel personally targeted by the weather, like the atmosphere itself had chosen sides. Vivian Hawthorne stood at the top of those steps and let it hit her. She wasn't wearing a coat. She'd left it on the back of her chair in courtroom 7, draped over the mahogany deliberately, the way you leave something behind when you want to make a point. Her ivory blouse went translucent inside the first 10 seconds. Her dark hair plastered itself against the side of her face. She didn't push it away. She just stood there, very still, and looked at the street below like she was reading something written in the rain itself. Behind her, the courthouse doors swung open. Damian Cross stepped out like a man who'd just been handed the deed to the world. He was 44, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that had aged into something sharper and colder. A jaw that photographed well, and eyes that never quite warmed even when he smiled. He was smiling now. He had on a charcoal Brioni suit, not a single drop of water on it, because 2 of his assistants had materialized from nowhere with an umbrella large enough to shelter a small family. Behind him, his attorney, a compact gray-haired man named Aldridge, who smelled perpetually of spearmint and moral flexibility, was shaking hands with someone and already looking at his phone. Damian stopped a few feet behind Vivian. He let the silence stretch. "You know," he said, just loud enough to carry over the rain, "I expected something from you. Tears, a scene. You always liked your scenes." Vivian didn't turn around. "I thought maybe you'd beg," Damian continued, sliding his hands into his pockets with the casual ease of a man who hadn't lost a single night of sleep over any of this. "I had a speech ready, practiced it, even. Very gracious, very magnanimous." He paused. Wasted the preparation, apparently. She still didn't answer. That irritated him. It always had. That particular silence of hers, the one that wasn't avoidance, but something closer to assessment. Like she was calculating something behind those still brown eyes, and whatever she arrived at, she'd decided he wasn't worth the words yet. "The settlement was fair," he said, his voice hardening slightly at the edges. "More than fair, honestly. You had good lawyers. You chose to walk away from all of it. That's on you." Vivian turned then. Not dramatically. She didn't spin around or square her shoulders or do any of the things a woman in a movie would do. She just turned, slowly, and looked at him the way you look at something you've already finished thinking about. "I know," she said. 2 words. Flat and dry, and completely without heat. Damian blinked. Whatever he'd been braced for, and he'd been braced for quite a bit, given the last 18 months, it wasn't that. "That's all you've got?" "That's all you deserve," she said, and turned back to face the street. His jaw tightened. He stepped forward until he was standing beside her, close enough that she could smell the cedar and bergamot of the cologne he'd been wearing for 15 years and now made her stomach turn by pure Pavlovian reflex. "You have nothing, Vivian." His voice had dropped, gone quieter, which was always more dangerous than when he raised it. "No house, no accounts, no income. You signed away every protection you had. The prenup I offered before you walked into this marriage was better than what you're walking out with." He tilted his head slightly. "You walked away from $12 million. People don't do that unless they're either very stupid or very arrogant. I've never thought you were stupid." She let the rain fall on her face for another moment. "Then you should have paid closer attention," she said. Damian opened his mouth to respond, and that was when the sound reached him. It started as a vibration more than a noise, a deep, low rumble that didn't belong to weather or traffic, something too synchronized and too disciplined to be either. It climbed the street below from the direction of the parking structure on 5th, and then it came around the corner, and every person standing under that overhang went very quiet in a way that crowds sometimes go quiet when something enters a space that simply cannot be argued with. 6 matte black Chevrolet Suburban Ultras, each one armored, each one moving at exactly the same speed and exactly the same distance apart. Not the haphazard convoy of politicians or corporate executives, but the kind of formation that spoke of military precision adapted for civilian use, the kind that said the people inside it had been doing this long enough to turn it into choreography. They moved through the rain without hurry. The lead vehicle's windows were blacked out so completely they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They rolled to the base of the courthouse steps and stopped. Every door on every vehicle opened at once. The men who stepped out were not bodyguards in the sense that most people understood that word. They were not thick-necked men in ill-fitting blazers scanning crowds with darting eyes. These were something else. Still, measured, dressed identically in black that matched the vehicles, and they moved to their positions with a quietness that was almost architectural, as though they were structural elements being placed rather than men walking. There were 14 of them. Vivian had counted without looking like she was counting. The rear door of the third vehicle, not the first, not the last, but the precise middle, opened last. The man who stepped out to hold it was older, perhaps 60, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had never once in his life slouched. He was not a bodyguard. His bearing was something above that. The deference in the way he stood beside the open door told you everything about the relationship between himself and whoever was still inside. He stood. He waited. And Vivian Hawthorne walked down the steps of the courthouse. She walked through the rain without running, without hurrying, without covering her head. She walked the way someone walks when they know exactly where they're going and have known for some time. She reached the bottom of the steps, and the 14 men in black parted for her without being asked, creating a corridor straight to the open vehicle door, and every single one of them, without exception, lowered his head as she passed. Not a nod, a bow. Small, controlled, but unmistakable. She reached the door. She glanced back once, just once, and for a moment her eyes found Damien's. His face had gone the color of old concrete. She didn't say anything. She didn't smile. She just held his gaze for 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then she stepped inside, and the silver-haired man closed the door behind her with a sound like a bank vault settling into its lock, and the convoy reassembled and moved back into the rain and was gone. Damien Cross stood at the top of the courthouse steps with his umbrella and his Brioni suit and his attorney who smelled like spearmint, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something he did not have a good name for. It was close to fear. It wasn't quite fear yet, but it was close. Vulcan. The inside of the limousine smelled like leather and something older. Cedar, maybe? Or the particular dryness of fine-aged wood. The kind of smell that accumulated over decades in places where serious men made serious decisions. The cabin was longer than it appeared from outside, divided not by ostentation, but by function. 2 rear-facing seats across from a long bench, a small brushed steel console between them, a partition of smoked glass separating the passenger compartment from the driver. No screens, no minibar, no performance. Salvatore Moretti sat in the far seat with his hands folded in his lap and watched Vivian settle across from him. He was 61 years old and looked like a man who had arrived at 61 by surviving things that would have killed most people twice over. He was not large, perhaps 5'10", lean, with the carefully maintained stillness of someone who had learned early that men who moved a great deal were usually trying to compensate for something. His hair was iron gray, his face deeply lined in a way that wasn't ugly but precise. Every crease earned, none of it soft. His eyes were a pale gray-green that occasionally looked like still water, and occasionally looked like something that lived underneath it. He did not reach out to shake her hand. He did not open with pleasantries. "You're wet," he said. "I'm aware," Vivian said. He unfolded his hands and reached to the console between them, where a folded dark wool blanket sat waiting. He passed it across without ceremony. She took it without ceremony. She wrapped it around her shoulders and pushed the wet hair back from her face with both hands, a gesture that was wholly practical and entirely unself-conscious. And he watched her do it the way he watched everything, completely, cataloging. "He let you stand in the rain," Salvatore said. It wasn't a question. "He enjoyed it," Vivian said. "He always enjoyed watching me be uncomfortable." She looked up. "He's going to look into who owns these vehicles. He won't find anything. He has people." "His people are going to be very busy," Salvatore said, "in approximately 72 hours. He paused. "That's why I'm here, Vivian, because I need you to understand that when I came today, I wasn't coming to offer sympathy. I was coming to offer a door." She looked at him steadily. "I know what kind of door it is." "Do you?" "It's the same door I walked through 11 years ago, before I walked back out of it." She kept her voice level. "You're asking me to come back." Salvatore tilted his head slightly. "I'm asking you to consider what you actually want. I want what I just watched happen in that courtroom to be the beginning of something, not the end of it." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now," she said. "Is that enough to work with?" Salvatore studied her for a long moment. The rain beat against the armored panels of the vehicle in a steady percussion that filled the silence without breaking it. "It was always enough to work with," he said finally. "That was never the problem." What Damien Cross knew about his ex-wife's past could be written in a short paragraph. He knew she'd grown up in Pittsburgh, middle class, sharp, the kind of girl who'd won scholarships and graduated early and arrived in New York at 22 with a mathematics degree and something to prove. He knew she'd worked in financial analysis before they'd met at a charity dinner in 2013. He knew she'd been, during their marriage, quiet and organized, and occasionally infuriatingly correct about things she had no formal reason to be correct about. He knew she'd had a period in her mid-20s that she'd never talked about in any detail. A few years that were thin on specifics and populated with vague references to consulting work and travel. He had assumed, the way wealthy men often assume things about the women around them, that the vagueness was unimportant, that there was simply nothing there to talk about, that the years before she met him were a draft, and he was the final version. He had been catastrophically wrong. What Vivian Hawthorne had actually done between the ages of 23 and 28 was build the financial architecture of one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in the northeastern United States. Not laundering, exactly. Or not only. She had designed something more elegant than that. A series of interlocking legitimate business entities, structured as holding companies with complex ownership chains that reached through 4 different jurisdictions, each one profitable enough on its own terms to withstand an audit, each one also serving as a node in a network that moved money with the kind of precision that made federal investigators feel like they were trying to read a book in a language that hadn't been invented yet. She had been 23 years old when Salvatore Moretti had hired her, on the recommendation of a man who'd seen her work on a smaller scale and understood immediately what she was capable of. She had been 24 when he'd stopped calling her the girl from Pittsburgh and started calling her by her name. She had been 26 when the Moretti Syndicate had expanded into 3 new territories in 18 months without a single RICO exposure, and Salvatore had looked at her across a conference table in the basement of a restaurant in Red Hook and said, very quietly, that she had a permanent place at his table for as long as she wanted one. She had wanted one. For 2 years she had wanted exactly that. Then she had met Damien Cross at a gala for a children's literacy foundation, a legitimate event she'd been attending as cover for one of the business fronts, and something had happened that she hadn't prepared for and couldn't entirely explain even now, years later, in a rain-soaked limousine in a city that was already becoming a different city than the one she'd left behind in the courthouse. She had believed she could leave. She had told Salvatore. She had expected anger and had received something worse, a very long silence, followed by a single question. "Is he worth what you're giving up?" She had said yes. She had been wrong about that too. But the wrongness had taken 10 years to fully reveal itself, which was the particular cruelty of that kind of mistake. Not the dramatic failure, but the slow one. The one that happened in increments so small you couldn't point to the exact moment it became irreversible. Damien had not hit her. She wanted to be clear about that inside her own head because she had watched other women's stories get flattened into that single narrative, and she knew it wasn't the only shape damage could take. What Damien had done was more architectural. He had worked systematically and with considerable intelligence to remove every source of confidence she had outside of him. He had dismissed her opinions in front of people whose opinions mattered to her. He had taken credit, gently and plausibly, for ideas she'd had. He had cultivated a version of her, slowly, over years. A version that was calmer and quieter and more accommodating and less threatening. And he had rewarded that version so consistently that she had at some point stopped noticing the woman underneath it, who was pressing her palms flat against the inside of the walls and trying not to scream. She'd noticed 11 months ago. The notification had come to a secondary email address she'd maintained out of habit, one of several she'd created years before Damien, attached to identities that were clean and functional and invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for exactly them. She rarely checked it. She had checked it on a rainy Tuesday in November because she'd been sitting in their kitchen at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, which had been happening with increasing frequency, and she'd picked up her personal laptop almost by accident. The email was from a forwarding system she'd set up years before she'd met Damien, a tripwire, essentially, attached to one of the business entities she'd designed for the Moretti organization. It had been dormant for years. It had activated because someone had attempted to access the core ownership documents of one of her shell structures and had been blocked by the secondary encryption she'd embedded. That someone had been using an access protocol she'd designed herself. The only person she'd ever given it to was Damien. She had sat in their kitchen for 45 minutes reading the details of what she was looking at. Then she had closed the laptop and gone upstairs and stood in the doorway of their bedroom and watched her husband sleep, and something had cracked open in her chest. Not dramatically, not with noise, but the way ice cracks in early spring, that sound like a gun going off somewhere in the distance. By morning she had known what she was going to do. It had taken 11 more months to do it correctly. Quote, the convoy reached the Moretti organization's Midtown holding, not the public one, not the restaurant or the property management company, but a 10-story building in Midtown East that officially housed a private equity consultancy and actually housed several dozen people who owed their continued freedom to the precision and discretion with which the organization had been constructed. A private elevator brought Vivian and Salvatore to the 7th floor, where a conference room occupied most of the interior. No windows, climate-controlled, insulated against electronic surveillance in 3 different ways, swept twice daily by a team that took the work seriously. 4 people were already waiting. Vivian recognized 2 of them. Marco Ferrante, Salvatore's head of operations, a compact, dark-eyed man of 40-something who had the particular watchfulness of someone who'd spent 20 years in rooms where the wrong answer got you buried, and Elise Kaufman, the organization's in-house legal architect, a woman of perhaps 50 who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the posture of someone who'd once played competitive chess and never fully left the headspace. The other 2 she didn't know, but she cataloged them. Mid-30s, technically inclined based on the laptops open in front of them, both with the slightly distracted quality of people who were thinking about problems she hadn't been briefed on yet. Marco looked at Vivian when she walked in. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, an adjustment, a recalibration. Vivian, he said. Marco. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She'd left the blanket in the car. She was still damp. She didn't particularly care. Tell me where we are. He glanced at Salvatore. She's asking the question, Salvatore said, in the tone of someone who was not in the habit of saying things twice. Marco looked back at Vivian. Cross has been using a subsidiary network to move capital offshore for the last 3 years. The structure is... Actually, it's good. Whoever designed it understood what they were doing. I know who designed it, Vivian said. Marco paused. The access protocol that triggered the alert. He stole it, she said. From documents I had on a personal device during the first year of our marriage. I didn't notice because I wasn't looking for it. He's been sitting on it for a decade, waiting for a use. The room was quiet for a moment. He knew what you were, Elise said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question shaped like a statement. He suspected, Vivian said. He never asked directly. He was too careful for that. He didn't want confirmation. He wanted leverage, which is a different thing. She folded her hands on the table. He married me partly because he was attracted to me and partly because he wanted to understand the architecture I'd built. He thought proximity would eventually give him access. She paused. He was right. That was my failure. No one in the room offered her absolution for it. She hadn't expected any. What I want to know, she said, is who he's working with. Because the offshore structure he built using my protocol is larger than what he'd need for his own exposure. He's moving money for someone else. The two younger technicians exchanged a look. We started pulling threads on that yesterday, one of them said. His name, she'd learn later, was Dev, and he was better at what he did than anyone had told her. The beneficial ownership traces through a series of Isle of Man entities before it dead ends. But the pattern of the transactions, the timing, the amounts, the routing through specific correspondent banks, it matches a signature we've seen before. He pulled up a document on his laptop and turned it to face her. Vivian looked at it for a long moment. Her expression didn't change, but something happened behind her eyes. That same thing Marco had seen when she walked in, but deeper and colder. When did this start? She asked. 18 months ago, maybe 20. She looked up at Salvatore. He was watching her with the same still attention he'd had in the car. He already knew what she was looking at. She understood, in that moment, that part of why he'd come today. Part of why the convoy and the choreography and the gravity of the statement it made was not only about her. It was about this. He needed her to see it and to be the one to recognize what it meant, because she was possibly the only person in the room who fully understood the implications. He's not just laundering his own money, she said. No, Salvatore said. He's laundering for someone who has been trying to get inside your network for 3 years. She held his gaze. And Damien Cross just handed them my architecture to do it with. The room went very quiet again, different from before. So this isn't just about my divorce, she said. It never was, Salvatore said. But I needed you to see it yourself. I needed you to choose it yourself. He looked at her steadily. Because what comes next is not going to be quiet. And I needed to know that the woman sitting across from me right now is the one who built what I need to protect, not the woman who walked away from it. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside this room, 14 stories above the street, the rain was still falling. Damien Cross was somewhere in this city, in a car, already calling people, already beginning to understand that something had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. Already, perhaps, starting to be a little afraid without fully understanding why. She had spent 10 years being careful not to be herself. She thought about what that had cost her. She thought about it precisely, without sentimentality, the way you add up a column of numbers, honestly, without rounding. Then she looked at the document on the laptop screen again, and she thought about the name embedded in the ownership chain that she had recognized immediately. Victor Kane. I need access to everything Damien filed in the last 3 years, she said. Tax returns, corporate disclosures, the subsidiary network documents, all of it. And I need a full accounting of every touch point between his operations and Kane's organization. She looked at Dev. Can you get me that? Already started, he said. She nodded. She looked at Marco. I'll need a workspace. Private. Full system access. Isolated from the main network. Done. She looked at Elise. And I'll need to understand what Damien disclosed to federal regulators versus what he actually filed. I want to see the gap. Elise smiled, very slightly, the way a chess player smiles when someone else finally starts playing seriously. I've been building that spreadsheet for 2 days, she said. Vivian looked at Salvatore last. He was still watching her with that careful, measuring stillness. But something in it had shifted, a degree of ease, barely perceptible, the kind of thing you'd only catch if you'd known him long enough to understand how he read. The woman who walked away, Vivian said quietly. She made a mistake, but she also built something that's still standing 11 years later, which means she was good enough to protect it even when she wasn't here. She paused. I'm back now. Salvatore said nothing. He didn't need to. But across the table, Marco Ferrante was already reaching for his phone, and the two technicians were already moving between screens with the focused velocity of people who had just been told that the job they'd been preparing for had officially begun, and somewhere below them, in the rain-slicked streets of Midtown Manhattan, a man who had stood on courthouse steps 45 minutes ago, grinning at his own victory, was beginning, slowly and without fully understanding why, to feel the ground shift underneath him. Vivian opened the laptop Dev had pushed toward her. Her fingers found the keyboard, and the woman she had buried for 10 years opened her eyes. What? 3 floors below the conference room, in a monitoring station that was never fully dark, an alert appeared on a secondary screen, an automated protocol, one of dozens running constantly, watching external networks for specific signatures. This one had been dormant for a long time. It had just activated. Dev was already on his way to the elevator when his phone buzzed. He stopped, read the notification, and stood very still for a moment in the hallway outside the conference room. Then he walked back inside. "Vivian," he said. His voice was careful. "The access protocol you said Cross stole, the one he's been using in the offshore structure." She looked up. "It's been accessed again," Dev said, 20 minutes ago. "Different endpoint. Totally separate from Cross's network." He turned the phone screen to face her. "Someone else has a copy." The room went very still. Vivian looked at the notification on Dev's phone for a long moment without speaking. Her expression gave nothing away. Not surprise, not fear, not the particular kind of dread that the information warranted, but her hand, flat on the table beside the laptop, pressed down slightly, as though she needed something solid beneath it. "That's impossible," Elise said. "You said Cross was the only one who had access." "He was," Vivian said. "Then how—" "Because," Vivian said slowly, "if someone else has an activated copy, it means one of 2 things." She looked up at Salvatore. Her voice was very quiet. "Either Damien sold it, or someone took it from him." She paused. "And if someone took it from him, if Victor Kane's people are running my protocol independently, then they're not waiting for Damien to give them access anymore." She looked at Dev. "They're already inside." The notification sat on Dev's phone screen like a lit fuse. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. That was how Vivian measured it. Not by the clock on the wall, but by the number of times Marco Ferrante blinked, which was once, slowly, the way a man blinks when he's forcing himself not to reach for something he's keeping holstered. Elise had taken off her reading glasses and was holding them in both hands. The second technician, whose name Vivian still didn't know, had gone very still in the particular way of someone who has just understood that the problem in front of them is larger than the tools they came with. Salvatore hadn't moved at all. He was watching Vivian. "Walk me through it," he said. His voice was the same temperature it always was. That was the thing about Salvatore that had taken her months to stop finding unnerving, back when she was 23 and new and still believed that composure was a performance rather than a discipline. The man was genuinely calibrated. Whatever was happening inside him when the situation demanded fear or anger, he had routed it somewhere else long ago, and the rerouting had become permanent. "The protocol is a proprietary access structure," Vivian said. She was already pulling the laptop toward her. "I designed it to operate in layers. The outer layer looks like standard encrypted authentication, something any competent security system would generate. The inner layer is a behavioral pattern, a sequence of timing intervals and micro-commands that have to be executed in the right order. It's not a password. It's more like a handshake that only makes sense if you know the language it's written in." She was typing while she talked, pulling up the monitoring log that Dev's alert had connected to. "I gave Damien access to the outer layer years ago. He would have needed the inner layer separately, which means either I had it on a device he accessed without my knowledge, which is possible. I had a backup drive I stopped using in 2016, or someone who already had both layers independently gave him a working copy." "Who else had both layers?" Marco asked. Vivian didn't look up from the screen. 3 people. Salvatore, a man named Reeves, who handled system maintenance and died of a stroke in 2019, and me. The silence that followed that statement had a specific texture to it. Marco looked at Salvatore. "Don't," Salvatore said, without inflection. Marco looked back at Vivian. I'm not accusing you of anything. You were about to ask if I gave it to someone, Vivian said. The answer is no. Not intentionally, not ever. She turned the laptop to face the room. But look at the access timestamp, 20 minutes ago. The endpoint is masked. Whoever's running it knows what they're doing. But the geographic signature before it disappears puts the origin somewhere in the lower Hudson Valley. She paused. That's not where Damien is. He's in the city. His car is still parked in the structure on Center Street. Dev, you have eyes on that lot? Dev was already checking. Yeah, car's there. His driver hasn't moved. So it's not Damien, Vivian said, which means Kane's people have a working copy of the full protocol. Which means they didn't get it from Damien tonight. She sat back. They had it before tonight, before I walked out of that courthouse, before the convoy. She looked at Salvatore. How long have you been planning today? 3 weeks, he said. Did anyone outside this room know you were coming for me? A beat. Very short, but she caught it. Sal, she said. 2 people knew the timeline, he said. Marco. And my son. The room's temperature changed. Marco's jaw set. He turned his face slightly to the left, which was what he did, Vivian would come to learn, when he was keeping something behind his teeth that wanted very badly to come out. Your son, Vivian said carefully, is not in this room. No, Salvatore said. He's not. Where is he? Salvatore was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to tell her something. Connecticut, he said. He's been managing the Hartford operation for the last 8 months. And the Hartford operation, Vivian said, is how far from the lower Hudson Valley? Nobody answered that. Nobody needed to. Vivian looked at Salvatore and saw, for the first and only time in her experience of him, something that was not quite composure. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something older and more complicated than either. The expression of a man who has been carrying a suspicion for long enough that having it confirmed out loud in front of other people is almost a relief, and he hates himself for that relief because of what it means about his son. Sal, she said. Her voice was not soft exactly, but it had lost its edge. How long have you known? I haven't known anything, he said. I've suspected. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. Niccolo has been making decisions that don't follow the logic I taught him. Money moving in ways that benefit the operation on paper but create exposures I wouldn't have accepted. 3 times in the last year. Each time there's been a reasonable explanation. Each time I've accepted it. He paused. Because he's my son. And now? And now, Salvatore said, I need to know whether what I'm looking at is a coincidence or a confirmation. He looked at Dev. Can you trace the access endpoint further, past the geographic mask? Maybe, Dev said. Give me 40 minutes. You have 20, Vivian said. She looked at Marco. I need everything you have on the Hartford operation for the last 8 months. Every transaction, every communication log, every external contact. Marco didn't move. He was looking at Salvatore. Marco, Salvatore said. Do what she says. Marco looked at Vivian for one more second. There was something in it that wasn't hostility exactly, more like the way a man looks at a door he's not sure he wants opened, knowing that once it is, he doesn't get to go back to the version of things that existed on the other side. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. Bassett. Vivian had the workspace she'd asked for within the hour. A room 3 doors down from the conference room, a single workstation with isolated network access, and a secondary monitor she could run parallel analysis on. She worked with her jacket off and her sleeves pushed to the elbows, barefoot because her heels had been soaking wet, and she'd abandoned them at the door. Someone had brought coffee. She didn't look up when they set it down. She'd built the financial architecture of the Moretti Syndicate when she was 23 years old, which meant she'd been looking at it from the inside, designing the connections, understanding how each node related to the others. What Damien had stolen wasn't just the access protocol. He'd stolen a map. And if that map was now in the hands of someone sophisticated enough to use it, someone who understood what they were looking at, who had the resources to exploit the connections rather than just expose them, then what Vivian was dealing with was not a breach. It was an occupation. Someone had been moving through the architecture she'd built the way a thief moves through a house they've studied from the blueprints, touching things without leaving fingerprints, taking what they wanted in increments small enough not to trip any alarms. For 18 months, maybe 20. She pulled up the transaction logs from 3 of the Moretti organization's primary legitimate fronts: a real estate holdings company, a logistics firm with contracts across the Mid-Atlantic, and a private lending operation that maintained meticulous compliance paperwork for exactly the reason that its actual function required it to look boring. She started with the real estate company because real estate was where money went when it needed to stop moving and start existing, and if someone was laundering through the architecture she'd built, they'd need a resting place eventually. It took her 11 minutes to find the first anomaly. It wasn't large. A single transaction, a property acquisition in Bergen County, channeled through a subsidiary that shouldn't have had the capital authorization for that kind of purchase without a second sign-off. The sign-off was there. The authorization code was legitimate. But the sequence was wrong. The inner timing of the approval had happened 6 minutes before the initiation request had been submitted, which was a one-way impossibility unless whoever was executing it had pre-authorized the transaction before the official record showed it being requested, which meant someone on the inside had known it was coming. She leaned back in her chair and pressed her fingers against her mouth and looked at the screen. Then she pulled up the second front. The logistics firm. 23 minutes. That was how long it took this time. A routing adjustment on a series of shipments through a distribution hub in Weehawken. Not the cargo itself, just the documentation attached to it. A modification to the manifest records that was small enough to be a clerical correction and significant enough, if you understood what the manifest numbers correlated to constitute a complete falsification of what was actually moving through that hub. The authorization code on the modification belonged to a mid-level operations coordinator. Vivian pulled the coordinator's personnel file. Hired 14 months ago. Background check clean. References verified. Prior employment at a legitimate freight company in Queens that had, when she looked it up, dissolved its corporate registration 9 months after the coordinator had left it. Dissolved and refiled under a different name. A name that appeared, when she followed the chain, in the beneficial ownership documentation of one of Victor Kane's known shell entities. She sat with that for a moment. Let it settle. Then she picked up the coffee and drank half of it standing up, because she needed something to do with her hands that wasn't putting them through the wall. Marco came back at midnight with a folder that he set on the edge of her workstation without opening it. Hartford, he said. She opened it herself. The first page was a summary of the operation's financials for the last 8 months. She scanned it quickly. Not the numbers themselves, but the shape of them, the pattern. The way a musician doesn't hear individual notes but hears the structure underneath them. It took her less than 30 seconds. He's been skimming, she said. That's one word for it. Not small amounts. She turned a page. He's been routing commission overrides through a fee account that shouldn't be generating this volume. Either the Hartford operation is performing at about 400% above what you'd expect given its market footprint, which is possible, but that would have generated external attention you'd have noticed. Or someone's been running parallel revenue through the legitimate channels to pad the numbers. She looked up. How good is your external audit coverage on Hartford? Quarterly, Marco said. The last one was in August. Who conducted it? He named a firm. Vivian wrote the name on the notepad beside the workstation. I want to see their methodology. Specifically, I want to know whether they had access to the subsidiary ledgers or just the consolidated statements. You think the audit was compromised? I think if Nicolo has been doing this for 8 months and no one noticed, the answer is either that he's very good or that something was in place to make sure the right people weren't looking at the right things. She turned another page. How much does your son know about the protocol I built? Marco's expression shifted. That's a question for Sal. I'm asking you. He looked at her for a moment. He knows the organization runs on a financial structure his father built before he was involved. He knows it's sophisticated. Beyond that, Marco shrugged, one shoulder tight. Nicolo has always been more interested in the street side of things, the operations. He had less patience for the finance. Then he didn't steal the protocol himself, Vivian said. He wouldn't know what to do with it. She looked back at the folder, which means someone showed him what it was worth. Someone who already had it, or already had access to it, came to Niccolo and offered him something in exchange for position inside the organization. She paused. Kane. You're certain? I'm not certain of anything, she said. I have a transaction pattern that matches Kane's signature, a personnel plant in the logistics operation, an inside access to financial architecture that couldn't have come from Damien alone, and a timeline that puts the initial breach 18 months ago, which is roughly when Niccolo took over Hartford. She closed the folder. I'm not certain, but I've built enough models to know what the shape of a thing means, even before you can name every part of it. Marco was quiet for a moment. Sal needs to know tonight, he said. It wasn't a question. He already knows, Vivian said. He's been knowing and not wanting to finish the thought. We're just finishing it for him. She stood up, pushed her chair back. Where is he? His office, top floor. Is Niccolo reachable right now? Marco's jaw tightened. He checks in at midnight. That was... He looked at his watch. 18 minutes ago. He would have called from the Hartford facility. Did he call? Marco's silence was its own answer. Salvatore's office on the 10th floor was not what people who had only heard of Salvatore Moretti would have imagined. There was no dark wood paneling, no heavy leather, no artifacts of power arranged for effect. It was a working room. 2 long tables pushed together to form a desk, a wall of shelving that held binders and hard drives, and the occasional architectural drawing, a window that looked north toward the park, currently showing nothing but rain and the reflected orange of the city's nighttime haze. He was standing at the window when Vivian came in. He didn't turn around. She set the relevant documents on his desk. She didn't explain them. She waited. He turned eventually. He looked at the papers without touching them for a moment. Then he picked up the top sheet, the transaction summary from the Bergen County property acquisition, and read it with the deliberate pace of someone who is making himself read slowly because he already understands what it says. He put it down. My son, he said. Not a question, not quite a statement, something between the two. I can't prove he knew what he was facilitating, Vivian said carefully. It's possible Kane approached him with something that looked like a business arrangement, and he didn't understand the full scope of what he was enabling. People accept things without reading the full terms. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She paused. But whether he understood it or not, the result is the same. Kane has had access to your financial network for 18 months. He has at least one person embedded in your logistics operation. And he has a working copy of the access protocol I built, which means if he wants to, he can move money through your legitimate structures in ways that look like your transactions, not his. Salvatore sat down. For the first time since she'd met him again today, in the rain and the limousine and the deliberate choreography of the courthouse steps, he looked like a man who was carrying something heavy. What's the exposure? He said. If Kane decides to weaponize what he has, to run transactions through your architecture that attract federal attention, he can make your organization look like the origin point of his operations. He's not laundering through you for profit. He's building a case that he can hand to the federal government anytime he wants to. Vivian sat down across from him. This was never about money, Sal. It's about leverage. He wants to be able to hand you to the FBI the moment you become inconvenient. Salvatore looked at her steadily. And Damien Cross, he said. What's his role in this? Damien is the bridge. He's been operating as an intermediary, a respectable, publicly visible face that makes the connection between Kane's money and legitimate markets. His tech company is the entry point. The offshore structures he built using my protocol are the transit corridors. He probably doesn't understand the full scope of what Kane is doing any more than Niccolo does. She paused. But he's in it deep enough that if this unravels, he goes down with it. Salvatore nodded slowly. You said probably doesn't understand. I said probably. Is there a version where he does understand? She held his gaze. There's a version where Damien specifically targeted me because someone told him who I was and what I'd built and what accessing that would be worth. In that version, he's not just an intermediary, he's an asset, recruited before he ever walked into that charity gala. She let that sit for a moment. I don't know which version is true. Not yet. But you want to find out. I want to find out everything, she said, and then I want to take it apart. All of it. Kane's operation, Damien's network, the embedded personnel, the financial architecture he's corrupted. I want to strip it down to the studs and hand whatever's left to the federal authorities in a package so complete that they never have to come looking for anything else. She looked at him. But I need two things. Tell me. I need Niccolo contained, not removed, not confronted, not yet. Contained. If Kane knows that Niccolo's been identified, he'll move. I need him to believe everything is still running normally until I've located every piece of his access. Salvatore's face was unreadable, but his hands, flat on the desk in front of him, had pressed down against the surface. And the second thing, he said, I need Damien Cross to think I'm afraid of him. Salvatore looked at her. I need him scared enough to move, she said. Right now he's standing on those courthouse steps in his head, grinning. He thinks I walked away from the settlement because I had no other option. I need him to keep believing that until he makes a call or sends a message or pulls a file that leads me to Kane's operational center. She paused. And for him to do that, he needs to believe he's still winning. Can you do that? Salvatore said. Pretend to be losing to the man who just spent 10 years. I spent 10 years pretending to be someone I wasn't for a man who didn't deserve the performance, she said. Doing it for 96 hours to a man I've already finished with is the easiest thing on this table. Salvatore was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the rain was finally beginning to ease. Not stop, just soften, the way it sometimes did in the small hours before it made up its mind about the morning. There's something else, he said. She waited. Niccolo called me at 10 tonight, he said, before the midnight check-in, before he went dark. He paused. He said he'd heard about today, about the courthouse, about you. How? He didn't say. He asked me if I was certain about bringing you back in. Salvatore looked at his hands. He said, his exact words, he said, Dad, she's been gone 11 years. You don't know who she is anymore. Vivian listened to that. What did you tell him? She said. I told him I'd known her since she was 23 years old and that I trusted my own judgment. Salvatore looked up. He hung up. That was the last communication before he went dark. He paused. If he warned Kane, then Kane already knows I'm here, Vivian said. And if Kane knows I'm here, the 96-hour window I was calculating just became a great deal shorter. She stood up. She picked up the documents she'd set on his desk and held them to her chest for a moment, looking at the rain-blurred window. I need Dev to keep running that endpoint trace, she said. And I need Marco to quietly pull the embedded coordinator from the logistics operation before morning. Make it look like a routine reassignment, nothing that would raise a flag. Can he do that without Niccolo knowing? Marco can do anything without anyone knowing, Salvatore said. It's his primary skill. Good. She moved toward the door. She was already thinking 3 levels ahead, the part of her brain that had always worked this way, that had never actually stopped working this way, even through 10 years of a marriage that had been specifically designed to convince her it had gone quiet. Get some sleep, Sal. You're going to need to be functional in the morning, and right now you look like a man who's been hit by something. My son may have sold me to my enemies, Salvatore said. That qualifies. She stopped at the door. She looked back at him, and there was something in the way she did it. Not pity, not comfort, not the performed softness she'd learned to produce on demand during her marriage. Just a plain, honest acknowledgement of what he was carrying. I know, she said, and I'm sorry, but we deal with what's real, not what we wished was real. That's the only way through it. She left him there with the rain and the city and whatever a man feels when he sits with the confirmation of the thing he spent months refusing to confirm. In the corridor, she was already moving. It was 2:17 in the morning when Dev knocked on the frame of her workspace door, and she looked up from 3 simultaneous analysis windows to see his face, which had the particular expression of someone who has found something they were not entirely prepared to find. "The endpoint trace," he said. "Tell me." "I got through the geographic mask." He came in, set his own laptop beside hers, pulled up the result. The access point originated from a device registered to a network in Westchester County. Specifically, he turned the screen to face her, from an IP block associated with a private residence in Terrytown. Vivian looked at the address. She looked at it for a long time. "Run the property registration," she said. Her voice was very even. Dev pulled it up. He was quiet as he did it, because he'd already run it before he came upstairs. The property in Terrytown was registered to a holding company. The holding company's beneficial owner, traced through 2 layers of Delaware filings, was a woman named Catherine Reeves, the widow of the man named Reeves who had died of a stroke in 2019, the man who had been one of 3 people with full access to both layers of the protocol Vivian had built. Vivian sat back in her chair. "He didn't die with the information," she said very quietly. "He gave it to someone first." "His wife," Dev said, "who has apparently been sitting on it for 4 years, Vivian said, "and she just used it tonight." She looked at Dev. "Which means she's been contacted. Someone reached out to her, gave her a reason to activate something she'd been holding dormant for 4 years. She paused. "Find out who she's been in contact with in the last 30 days. Phone records, financial transactions, anything that puts another person in her orbit." Dev was already typing. Vivian stood up and walked to the window of the small workspace and looked out at the city that was beginning very slowly to show the first gray suggestion of morning somewhere behind the clouds. 3 people had held the complete protocol: Salvatore, Reeves, and her. Reeves had passed it to his wife before he died. His wife had just activated it, tonight, within hours of Vivian's return becoming known, which meant someone had told Catherine Reeves that Vivian was back, and Catherine Reeves had responded by sending a signal. The question was who she was sending it to. Dev made a sound at the keyboard, not a word, just a breath, the involuntary kind that happened when you opened a file and the file contained something you hadn't expected. "Vivian," he said. She turned. The phone records from Catherine Reeves's primary number for the last 30 days. He turned the laptop screen. "There are 11 calls to a number I can't immediately trace, but there's one incoming call, 3 weeks ago, 42 minutes long, from a number that traces to a burner purchased in cash at a store in Midtown Manhattan. And the store's security footage from the purchase date is available through a third-party archive system I have access to." He pulled up a still image, grainy, taken from a ceiling-mounted camera above a register. I pulled the timestamp frame. Vivian looked at the image on the screen. The figure at the register was wearing a jacket with the collar up and a hat pulled low enough that the face was partially obscured, but the jaw was visible, the angle of the shoulders, the particular way the figure held itself, the unconscious posture of a man who had spent his entire adult life believing he was the most important person in whatever room he occupied. There was no mistaking Damian Cross, the man who had stood on the courthouse steps this afternoon and told her she had nothing, the man who was, right now, somewhere in this city believing he had won, had purchased a burner phone 3 weeks ago and used it to contact the widow of a dead man, a woman who was sitting in a house in Terrytown with access to the full protocol of the Moretti financial architecture. This had not been a coincidence. This had not been opportunism. This had been a plan, constructed, patient, long-term. Damian Cross had not simply stumbled into Victor Kane's orbit. He had built his way there. And somewhere in the gap between what Vivian had believed about her marriage and what her marriage had actually been, there was a version of Damian Cross that she had never met. A version that was not the arrogant, casually cruel executive she'd divorced today, but something colder and more deliberate. A version that had found her on purpose. She stood at the window with that information and felt it move through her like ice water. Not fear, not quite, but the particular sensation of understanding something that changes the shape of everything that came before it, the way a single correction to a mathematical equation alters every result that followed from it. Her marriage, her 10 years, the man who had stood in the rain at the courthouse and grinned. She put her hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Then she turned around, picked up her phone, and called Marco. He answered on the first ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "I need you to do something," she said. "Tonight, before morning." "Tell me," Marco said. "Damien Cross keeps a secondary residence in addition to the main house," she said. "An apartment in Tribeca he's maintained under a corporate lease for the last 6 years. It's not in any of the public filings. I only know about it because I found the lease agreement in a file he thought I'd never look at." She paused. "I need eyes on that address. Continuous, starting now." "You think he's going there?" "I think he's going to make a call tonight that he doesn't want traced to anywhere obvious," she said. "And I think whoever he calls is going to tell us everything we still don't know." She paused. "Marco, this goes to Salvatore in the morning, everything I've found tonight. But right now, I need you to move before Cross does." "Already moving," Marco said, and the line went quiet. Vivian set the phone down on the desk and looked at Dev. "Keep running," she said. "Everything you have on Catherine Reeves, on the burner purchase, on the endpoint access. I want a complete picture by 5 a.m. "I'll have it," Dev said. She sat back down at the workstation and pulled up the next set of files. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. The city in the small hours of morning had gone to the strange, suspended quiet it sometimes reached. Not peaceful, exactly, but held, as though it was taking a single long breath between one thing and whatever came next. She had come into this building 3 hours ago with nothing but wet clothes and the knowledge that the man she'd married had been, in some version of the truth, a weapon pointed at her from the very beginning. She had come in with that knowledge and the decision, made somewhere on the courthouse steps in the rain, that she was going to burn down everything he'd built and salt the ground it stood on. What she hadn't known, 3 hours ago, was that the fire she was planning to set had already been set around her, and the only question remaining was whether she could outrun it or whether she was going to have to walk straight through it and come out the other side. She already knew the answer. She'd known it since she was 23 years old in a basement conference room in Red Hook, looking at a system she'd built from nothing, understanding for the first time what it felt like to be very good at something that most people couldn't even see. She wasn't going to run. Dev's laptop chimed softly. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, and his face had gone the color of someone who has just opened a door they can't close again. "Vivian," he said, "Catherine Reeves just made another access attempt. Different layer this time. Not the outer protocol. The inner one." He turned the screen. "She's trying to open the core ledger structure, the one that holds the origin records for every transaction in the Moretti network going back 11 years. He paused. "If she gets through—" "She won't," Vivian said. She was already typing. "Because I built a failsafe into that layer that nobody knows about. Not Reeves, not Salvatore, not anyone." Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the speed of someone who has been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this moment. "Nobody knows about it because I put it there the day I decided to leave, as insurance, and I never told a single person it existed." She hit the final key. On Dev's screen, Catherine Reeves' access attempt terminated. Not blocked, not bounced. Something more deliberate, a silent redirect that accepted the attempt, logged its full origin data, including the complete device signature and network path, and then returned a false confirmation before sealing the inner layer behind an encryption key that now existed only in Vivian's memory. "She thinks she got in," Dev said slowly. "She thinks she got in," Vivian confirmed, "which means whoever she reports to will think so too." She looked at Dev. "Now we wait for her to report, and when she does—" Her phone buzzed on the desk. Not Dev's phone, not the office system, her personal cell. The number she'd given to no one in this building, the number attached to an identity she hadn't used in 11 years. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She picked it up. She answered without speaking, just held it to her ear and waited. The voice on the other end was male, smooth, carrying the faint trace of an accent that had been mostly educated out of it. Eastern European somewhere underneath the American Polish, like a painting that had been done over but still showed the original brushwork if the light hit it right. "Ms. Hawthorne," the voice said, "or do you still go by Cross?" "I imagine not, given today's proceedings." She said nothing. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time," the voice said. "My name is Victor Kane, and I think you and I have quite a lot to discuss before the morning gets any further along." She didn't speak first. That was the only card she held right now, and she knew it, so she pressed it flat against her chest and held it there and waited, listening to the quality of the silence on Kane's end of the line. The ambient sound of it, the slight compression that told her he was in an enclosed space, climate-controlled, no traffic noise, no wind, which meant indoors or a very good vehicle, and the faint background hum that could have been HVAC or could have been the particular electronic undertone of a recording system running. She assumed it was both. "You're not going to say anything," Kane said. "Not a question." Mildly appreciative. "I respect that. I've dealt with a great many people in my line of work who can't tolerate silence. They fill it. They give things away before I've asked for them." A brief pause. "You won't do that." "Why are you calling me?" she said. Flat. No inflection. "Because we've arrived at a point where continuing to work around each other is less efficient than speaking directly," he said. "And because I think you've spent the last 3 hours discovering things that have surprised you, and I want you to know the extent of what I know before you make decisions based on an incomplete picture." "You think I'd trust your version of the picture?" "No," he said. "I think you'd use it as a data point. You're too good at what you do to dismiss information on the basis of the source." He paused. "That's a compliment, Ms. Hawthorne. I mean it as one." She said nothing. "Damien Cross came to me," Kane said. "I want you to understand that. He came to me 3 years ago, through an intermediary with an offer. He had something I wanted, access to a financial architecture sophisticated enough to move the kind of capital I deal with through channels that wouldn't draw attention. He knew what it was because he'd spent years studying the woman who built it." Another pause, and this one had a different quality, almost reflective. "He told me about you before I'd ever heard your name. He described what you'd built in enough detail that I had my own people verify it. They came back and told me it was the most elegant thing they'd seen." The accent underneath the smooth American surface thickened very slightly. "He sold you to me before he finished destroying you. I thought you should know that." She was standing very still at the window. Dev was watching her from across the room with the frozen attention of someone watching a wire walk. "And what did you give him in return?" she said. "I gave him access to markets his legitimate business couldn't reach. I gave him the kind of protection that money alone doesn't purchase. And I gave him—" Kane paused. "The specific introduction that allowed him to proceed with what I believe lawyers this morning referred to as irreconcilable differences." His voice remained smooth. "The evidence of infidelity that ended your marriage was manufactured. I provided it. He asked for a clean exit that left you with nothing and gave him cause. I arranged it." The room was very quiet. Dev had stopped typing. Vivian's hand, at her side, closed slowly into a fist. She had known, in the abstract, that her marriage had been a constructed thing, that Damien had found her for reasons beyond attraction, that the access he'd eventually stolen had been at least partly the point. She had believed, on the basis of evidence she now understood was incomplete, that the betrayal had begun somewhere in the middle years, that there had been a period of genuine feeling before the calculation set in. What Kane was telling her was that there had been no such period. The infidelity that Damien had documented, the photographs, the testimony, the meticulous paper trail that his lawyers had presented in the preliminary proceedings, and that Vivian's own attorneys had spent 3 months trying to counter before she'd told them to stop trying, had been fabricated. She had spent 8 months believing she understood the nature of the lie she'd been living. She had understood only the surface of it. The lie was older and colder and more total than she had known. "You're telling me this," she said, "because you want something." "I'm telling you this because what happens next depends on whether you understand the complete situation," Kane said. "I don't want you making moves based on a map that's missing half its territory." He paused. "Damien has become a liability. He always was a liability. That's the nature of intermediaries. They're useful until they're not. And Damien reached that point approximately 3 months ago when he made a decision about the offshore structure that exposed a routing corridor I'd specifically told him to leave alone. He went off script. He got greedy," Kane said, "which is the particular predictability of men who've been given access to more than they earned. I've been managing the exposure since then. Tonight's events—" She heard something in his voice that might have been amusement. "Tonight's events have accelerated the timeline considerably." Because I'm back, she said. Because you're back, he confirmed. And because you've spent the last 3 hours finding things in my architecture that I'd prefer remain unfound. I know you triggered the failsafe on the inner ledger. That was elegant, by the way. I didn't know it existed, which means Reeves didn't know it existed, which means you built it alone and told no one. A brief silence. I respect that kind of caution. She filed away the information that he'd been watching the access attempt in real time, which meant he had eyes on Catherine Reeves's system, which meant Catherine Reeves was not acting autonomously. She was being directed, monitored, managed. She was an instrument, not a player. What do you want from me? Vivian said. I want you to consider a proposition, Kane said. Damien goes away. I'll handle that. It's already in motion. The Moretti organization's existing architecture remains intact and continues operating as it has. In exchange, you come and do for my organization what you did for Salvatore Moretti 20 years ago. Full authority over financial structure. Compensation that would, let's say, significantly exceed what a decade of marriage settlement would have provided. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you the most significant financial engineering position in the private sector, he said. I'm offering you the chance to build something that operates at a scale Moretti's organization could never approach. His voice shifted very slightly, not warmer, but more direct, the performance of smoothness giving way briefly to something that was the actual pitch underneath it. You've spent 11 years not being yourself, Ms. Hawthorne. I'm offering you the chance to correct that. She said nothing for a long moment. And Salvatore, she said, that depends on decisions he makes in the next several days, Kane said. I have no particular desire to harm Salvatore Moretti. He's been running a clean operation for 30 years. If he steps back gracefully, the transition can be managed without conflict. And if he doesn't, then the conversation becomes more difficult, Kane said, without any change in tone whatsoever. For everyone. Vivian looked at the window, at the gray dark city, at the rain that had stopped and left the streets below reflecting light in long broken streaks. I'll need time to consider this, she said. You have until 8 a.m., Kane said. After that, I'm going to assume you've chosen the more difficult path, and I'll make the arrangements that path requires. He paused. I'd prefer you choose correctly. Talented people are genuinely rare, Ms. Hawthorne. I'd rather have you building things than have you become a problem I have to resolve. The line went dead. Vivian lowered the phone from her ear. Dev was staring at her. How much of that did you but... All of it, she said. She set the phone face down on the desk. Her voice was completely even. Her hands were completely steady. Start a recording trace on that number retroactively. I want the full origin chain, and I want this room swept for any transmission signals that might have been activated in the last half hour. Dev moved immediately. Vivian stood where she was for 30 seconds. Just stood. Let what she'd been told move through her the way cold moves through a building. Not all at once, but finding the gaps, settling into the spaces between the things you thought were solid. The infidelity had been manufactured. The end of her marriage, the specific mechanism of it, the photographs and the documented evidence, and the 8 months of legal proceedings that had worn her down to something barely recognizable, all of it had been arranged. By Kane, at Damien's request, before the marriage ended, which meant Damien had been planning the exit for long enough to contract the fabrication and allow it to develop and then deploy it at the moment of maximum utility, which meant she needed to recalculate everything she thought she knew about the timeline of her own life. She walked out of the workspace and down the corridor to the stairwell and climbed 2 flights to the roof access, and she pushed through the door and stood on the wet concrete of the roof in the dark, with the city spread around her in every direction, and took 4 slow breaths with her eyes open. She was not going to fall apart. She had not fallen apart at 23 when she was building financial architecture for a criminal organization and understanding for the first time what she was actually capable of. She had not fallen apart at 34 when the marriage began to show its true skeleton beneath the managed surface. She was not going to fall apart now. But she needed 30 seconds where no one was watching her, because what Kane had just told her had moved something inside her that she wasn't done processing, and she was too disciplined to let unprocessed things affect what she did next. She stood on the roof for 40 seconds. Then she went back inside. Then, she did not tell Salvatore about the call immediately. That was a deliberate choice, and she made it with full awareness of what it meant, that she was withholding information from the man who had just re-extended his trust to her, the man who had brought her back in, the man who was sitting on the 10th floor in his office with the knowledge that his son might have sold him. She withheld it because she needed to know something first. She found Marco at 2:45 in the morning in the corridor outside the monitoring station, running on what appeared to be bad coffee and the particular sustained focus of a man who'd been in high-stakes situations long enough that adrenaline had become indistinguishable from his resting state. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need a straight answer." He looked at her. "Ask." "Niccolo. The Hartford connection, the timeline." She held his gaze. "Before any of tonight, before the courthouse, before the protocol alert, before any of this, did you have an independent suspicion? Something you hadn't brought to Salvatore?" Marco was quiet for a beat that was approximately 1 beat longer than it would have been if the answer was no. "6 months ago," he said finally, "there was a transaction in the Hartford ledger that I flagged internally. I ran it myself, didn't hand it to an analyst. It looked like a vendor payment. The vendor didn't exist." He paused. "I told myself it was a bookkeeping error, filed it, and moved on." "Why?" He looked at her with the expression of a man answering a question he's been hoping no one would ask. "Because if it wasn't a bookkeeping error, I'd have to take it to Sal. And taking it to Sal meant telling him his son was dirty. And I've known Niccolo since he was 11 years old." Vivian absorbed that. "You buried a flag because you loved the family." "I buried a flag because I thought I might be wrong," Marco said. "And I didn't want to be the man who was right about that particular thing." She understood that. She understood it in a way that was almost physical, the way you recognize a version of your own mistake in someone else's face. "The transaction," she said. "Do you still have the file?" "I never deleted it." "Get it to Dev, tonight." He nodded. He started to move past her. She stopped him with a hand on his arm, not grabbing, just a placement. "Marco?" "Kane called me 40 minutes ago." He went still. She told him, concisely and completely, what Kane had said. The offer, the timeline, the manufactured evidence, the 8 a.m. deadline. Marco listened without interrupting. His face did several things in sequence: a tightening around the eyes, a slight forward pressure in the jaw, and then a stillness that was not calm but the opposite of calm, contained in the way a charge is contained. When she finished, he said one word: "Damien." "Yes." "He built this from the beginning." "From before the beginning," she said. "From before he found me. He knew who I was. He came in looking for the architecture." Marco turned his face away. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he turned back. "The convoy today. Kane will have people tracking Salvatore's movements. He'll know Sal came for you. He'll know you're here." "He already knows I'm here?" she said. "He told me as much. He's been watching everything. He has access to the monitoring systems through the embedded coordinator in logistics. I need Dev to find every other plant in the organization before morning, because right now, I don't know how many of Kane's people are inside the walls." Marco's jaw tightened. He said until 8 a.m. "Yes, it's 3 a.m. I'm aware." "What are you going to tell Salvatore?" She looked at him. "Everything, but I need an hour first. I need to understand what Kane's offer actually means before I take it to Sal, because if I walk upstairs and tell him without a strategy, what happens is we spend 4 hours on the emotional response instead of the operational response. And we don't have 4 hours for the emotional response." Marco looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but a species of recognition, the way soldiers recognize each other not by uniform, but by the way they stand when things go wrong. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour. He moved. Dev had 3 things ready when she came back to the workspace. The first was the retroactive trace on Kane's call number, which dead-ended, as she'd expected, in a relay chain that bounced through 4 international nodes before it went dark. But the exit node before the darkness was routed through a server cluster in northern New Jersey, which gave her a geographic corridor. The second was a preliminary scan of the building's internal communication systems for external transmission signatures, which had found two anomalies, both in the logistics coordination floor, 4 levels below, where the embedded coordinator had an access terminal that was still live at 3 in the morning, despite the fact that the coordinator was supposedly off shift. The third was something Dev had found while she was on the roof. I ran a deeper background on Damien Cross, Dev said. Not the public filing, a full historical trace, going back to before he founded the company. He turned his laptop to face her. I found something in his early employment history that wasn't in any of the databases I looked at 3 hours ago. It was in a subsidiary record I had to go 3 layers deep to find. He paused. He worked for a financial consulting firm in London for 18 months before he came back to New York and started the company. Small firm, private clients, very discreet. And, she said, the firm dissolved 6 months after he left. But the principal owner, the man who ran it, his name appears in the beneficial ownership chain of 2 of Victor Kane's earliest European entities. She looked at the screen. Dev said it anyway because it needed to be said out loud. Damien Cross has been connected to Victor Kane's network since before he came back to New York, since before he started the company, since before he ever walked into a charity gala and met you. He looked at her. This wasn't opportunism, it was a long-term placement. She sat down. She looked at the screen and she let herself sit with what it meant completely, not skimming the surface of it, but going all the way to the bottom. Damien Cross had been a plant, not recruited mid-marriage, not corrupted gradually by proximity to power, placed, deliberately and from the beginning. He had built a company specifically designed to serve as a legitimate vehicle for Kane's capital. He had married her specifically to obtain the architecture that would make that vehicle impenetrable to regulators. And he had maintained the marriage for 10 years because she had been more useful as a wife than as an ex-wife, until the moment she became a potential liability and Kane had provided him the tools to eject cleanly. 10 years. She had been a target for 10 years and had not seen it. She sat with that and did not allow herself to flinch away from it, because flinching was what happened when you weren't willing to look at something directly, and she was done with the years she'd spent not looking directly at things. Then she stood up. "Can you get me into the Tribeca Apartments building security system?" she said. "The one Marco has eyes on." Dev blinked. "You're going there?" "Not yet. I want to see what he's doing in real time before I decide." She looked at Dev. "Can you get me in?" "Give me 10 minutes, Dev said. It took him 7. The feed from the building's interior camera system came up on the secondary monitor in grainy night vision resolution. 4 cameras: lobby, elevator interior, 4th floor corridor, and one that covered the building's service entrance. The Tribeca apartment was on the 4th floor. Damien was in the corridor. Not inside the apartment. In the corridor, standing outside his own door, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing with one hand in the sharp, clipped manner of a man who is not getting what he wants from the person he's speaking to. He was still in the suit from the courthouse. His tie was gone. His hair, usually immaculate, had been pushed back multiple times by his own hand until it had lost its arrangement. She watched him pace the length of the corridor. He was frightened. She could tell from here, through a grainy camera feed, at 3 in the morning, the particular quality of the movement, the way fear expressed itself in the body differently than anger, that slightly over-controlled quality of the limbs of a man trying to maintain composure over something that was threatening the composure from the inside. He ended the call, stood in the corridor for a moment, then he went back inside. "I need to know who he just called," she said. "Working on it," Dev said. She watched the empty corridor on the feed. She thought about Kane's offer, the architecture, the clean relocation of everything she'd built into Kane's service, with Damien erased from the picture and the Moretti organization managed into a graceful retirement that may or may not include Salvatore's continued health. She thought about the 8 a.m. deadline. She thought about 11 years ago, sitting in a basement in Red Hook at 26 years old and being told she had a permanent place at a table, and choosing to walk away from it for a man who had already, at that point, been in service to the man who just threatened everyone at that table. She was done thinking about it. She knew what she was going to do. She picked up her phone and called Salvatore. He answered immediately, which confirmed he hadn't slept. "I need you downstairs," she said. "Conference room. Bring Marco." She paused. "And Sal? I need you to call Niccolo, right now before you come down. Don't tell him why. Just get him on the phone and find out where he physically is. Why? Salvatore said. His voice was absolutely controlled, and she heard underneath the control the question he was actually asking, which was not why, but how bad. Because in 45 minutes, I'm going to tell you everything I know, she said, and I need to know whether your son is in a place where we can reach him before Kane does. She heard Salvatore's breath on the line, slow, measured. I'll call him now, he said. She put the phone down. Dev looked up from his keyboard. The call Damien just made, I've got the recipient number. He turned the screen. It traces to a registered cell account. Name on the account is... He stopped. She looked at the screen. The name was Niccolo Moretti. The room seemed to tighten around her. Damien Cross had called Niccolo Moretti at 3 in the morning from the Tribeca apartment, and the call had lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Timestamp on the call, she said. Began at 2:58 a.m., Dev said. Ended at 3:02. 3 minutes before Salvatore had gone to his office, before she'd told Salvatore to call Niccolo. She picked up her phone and called Salvatore back. He answered in one ring. Did you reach him? She said. A pause. Very short. No answer, Salvatore said. His phone is going to voicemail. Because 4 minutes ago he was on the phone with Damien Cross, she said, and now he's gone dark. She paused. Sal, listen to me carefully. I need you to tell me where Niccolo is physically located when he's managing the Hartford operation, not the facility address. Where he sleeps, where he actually stays. Another pause. He keeps a house in Westport, Salvatore said slowly. Connecticut, about 40 minutes from Hartford. She looked at Dev. Pull up Westport, Connecticut. Private residential addresses associated with Niccolo Moretti or any of the Hartford operations corporate entities. Dev was already moving. Sal, she said, get downstairs, now. She set the phone down and looked at the camera feed still running on the secondary monitor. The Tribeca corridor. Empty. Still. Then a figure appeared in it. Not Damien. A man she didn't recognize. Large, moving with the particular fluid efficiency of someone professionally trained. A dark jacket. His face turned slightly away from the camera. He walked the length of the corridor and stopped outside Damien's apartment door. He didn't knock. He produced something from his jacket, she couldn't make out what, at this resolution, and had the door open in approximately 4 seconds. He went inside. Dev, she said. Her voice was absolutely controlled. Marco has people on that building. Yes. Call them, right now. Tell them there's a hostile inside the apartment. Dev grabbed his phone. On the feed, nothing moved in the corridor. The apartment door was closed. 20 seconds passed. 30. The apartment door opened again. The man walked out. He moved at the same pace he'd moved at going in. No hurry, no visible agitation. He walked back the way he'd come and disappeared from the camera's frame. The corridor was empty again. Dev was talking rapidly into his phone. She heard him say the floor number, heard him say, hostile exited, check the apartment, check the... She was already moving out of the workspace and into the corridor, reaching the elevator. Her phone buzzed as the elevator descended. Marco. She answered it. Damien Cross is dead, Marco said. His voice had the specific flatness of a man delivering information he has not yet fully processed. Our people found him on the apartment floor. Single entry wound, close range, professional. She stood in the elevator. The doors opened on the lobby level, and she stood there for a moment with the phone against her ear. Kane had said Damien was being handled. He'd said it was already in motion. She had thought he meant financially, legally. The kind of handled that made someone disappear into a federal case or an offshore relocation. He had not meant that. Damien Cross was dead. The intermediary had been removed. The bridge between the legitimate world and Kane's operation had been burned the moment it was no longer needed, which was the moment Vivian had come back and made the bridge's existence a liability. She had walked out of that courthouse this afternoon, and Damien had stood on the steps and told her she had nothing. 8 hours later, he was dead on the floor of a Tribeca apartment because the man he'd sold himself to had decided he was finished being useful. She stepped out of the elevator. She thought about 10 years, about the particular grief of understanding something completely wrong, not partially wrong, not wrong in some areas, completely, structurally wrong from the foundation up. She filed it. She would return to it when she could afford to. Right now, she couldn't afford to. "Marco," she said, "pull your people out of that building before the police arrive. A clean exit, nothing left behind." She started walking toward the conference room. "And I need you to tell me we have a way to reach Niccolo that doesn't go through his phone." "His second-in-command in Hartford," Marco said. "A man named Russo. Loyal to Sal, not to Niccolo. I can reach Russo directly." "Do it! I need to know if Niccolo is still in Westport or if he's moved." "On it." She pushed through the conference room door. Salvatore was already there, standing at the far end of the table. Not sitting, standing, with the posture of a man who had been told something on the way down and was managing what it had done to him. He looked at her when she came in. "Damien Cross," he said. "Kane cleaned up his own mess," she said. "Which means Kane is accelerating the timeline. He gave me until 8 a.m., but taking Damien out tonight means he's moving on parallel tracks. The offer to me was one track, the removal of exposed assets was another, and they're running simultaneously." She sat down. "Which means the 8 a.m. deadline is real, or earlier." "What was the offer?" Salvatore said. She told him. All of it. The call. The manufactured evidence. The London employment history and what it meant. The full scope of what Damien Cross had been from the beginning. Salvatore listened without moving. His face, across the long table under the conference room's flat light, was the face of a man undergoing something that he would not allow to become visible until he was alone, and she respected him enough not to look at him directly while he processed it. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then Salvatore said, very quietly, "He manufactured the evidence of your infidelity." "Yes." "The photographs, the testimony." "All of it." Salvatore was quiet for another moment. "You spent 8 months believing—" "Yes," she said, "and I'm done spending time on that particular belief. What I need right now, what we both need, is to understand what Kane's actual play is, because I don't think the offer was genuine. I think the offer was a probe. He wanted to see whether I'd take it, and more importantly, he wanted to know whether I'd tell Salvatore about it, and he knew I would, which means the offer was designed to do something other than recruit me." Salvatore looked at her. "It was designed to move us," she said, "to make us reactive, to put us in a position where we're making decisions at 3 in the morning based on a deadline he set, in response to information he controlled, reacting to a threat he defined." She put her hands flat on the table. "We stop reacting. Right now. We take the board back." "How?" Salvatore said. She looked at him. "I need to tell you something that I need you to hear without reacting to until I've finished explaining it." He held her gaze. "Tell me." "I think Niccolo has been feeding Kane information, but I don't think Niccolo fully understood what he was feeding it to or what it was being used for. The access protocol, the timeline of the Hartford anomalies, the transaction patterns, they're consistent with someone who was given a channel and told to use it without understanding the architecture it was connected to." She paused. "Your son is not innocent, but he may not be what Kane needs him to be in order for Kane's play to work, which means if we can reach Niccolo before Kane does—" "Before Kane does what?" Salvatore said. She didn't answer immediately because she needed him to get there himself. He got there. His face changed. "Kane is going to kill my son," he said. "Damien was useful until he was exposed," she said. "Niccolo has been useful until tonight. You know he called Damien at 3 in the morning. Kane will know that too. Kane will understand that Niccolo is a loose thread, someone who can connect Kane to the Hartford operation, to the protocol access, to the embedded personnel." She held Salvatore's gaze. "Kane doesn't leave loose threads." Salvatore moved toward the door. "Sal," her voice stopped him. "Not like that. Not by walking out of this building and getting in a car, because Kane has eyes on this building, and if you move without a plan, you're going to lead his people directly to Niccolo." She stood up. "Sit down. Give me 10 minutes. We do this right, or we don't get another chance to do it at all." Salvatore stopped. He stood with his back to her for a moment, his hand on the door frame, the posture of a man whose every instinct was pointed in one direction and was being asked to hold it. Then he came back to the table and sat down. She sat across from him. 10 minutes, he said. His voice was barely audible. 10 minutes, she said. And then we move. Outside the building, in the streets below, the city was doing what it always did in the last hours before morning. That deceptive stillness that was not peace, but the absence of noise. The kind of quiet that didn't mean nothing was happening, but meant what was happening was moving too quietly to hear. Kane had given her until 8 a.m. It was 3:24. In the workspace down the corridor, Dev's keyboard had gone silent. She heard him stand up. She heard him walk to the doorway. She heard him say her name, very carefully, in the tone of someone who has found something that cannot wait for 10 minutes. She looked up. Russo called Marco, Dev said. From Hartford. He stopped. Tell me, she said. Niccolo isn't in Westport, Dev said. He left the house 2 hours ago. Alone. In his personal car. No driver. He paused. Russo tracked his phone before it went dark. The last ping was... Dev stopped again, and she understood from the way he stopped that what he was about to say was going to change the shape of the next several hours in a way that none of them were fully prepared for. The last ping was on the Hutchinson River Parkway, southbound. He's coming to the city, Vivian. She looked at Salvatore. Salvatore's face was unreadable. He's coming here, she said, not because she thought Salvatore hadn't understood it, but because it needed to be spoken. Or he's going somewhere else in the city, Dev said. But his phone went dark on the parkway 40 minutes ago, which means he's been moving blind, no signal, for 40 minutes, which means either the battery died or someone told him to pull it, Marco said from the doorway, his own phone still in his hand. Someone told him to go dark and come south and not leave a trail. The room was quiet. Kane, Vivian said. Or someone working for Kane, Marco said. Someone who called him in the last 4 hours and gave him instructions. She looked at the table. She did the arithmetic, fast, the way she'd always done it. Variables, probabilities, outcomes weighted by the information available. Niccolo Moretti was somewhere in New York City with his phone dark, moving toward an unknown destination, 4 hours after his father's most dangerous strategic asset had returned from an 11-year absence, and 3 hours after Victor Kane had called that asset and made an offer that would require Niccolo to be permanently unavailable to corroborate anything. Somewhere in the city, a man Kane had already decided was a liability was driving toward a meeting that Kane had arranged, and the only way to stop it was to find Niccolo first, in a city of 8 million people with a dead phone and a 40-minute head start before Kane's people did. She stood up. I need every traffic camera feed on southbound routes from the Hutch, she said. His personal car, Marco, make and plate. 2023 black Mercedes E-Class, Marco said, and gave the plate number from memory. Dev, she said. Dev was already running. Salvatore stood up too, and this time she didn't tell him to sit down, because there was nothing left to sit for. Dev found the Mercedes at 3:41 a.m. Third camera on the southbound approach of the Bruckner Expressway, timestamp 3:29. The plate catching the light for exactly 1 frame before the vehicle moved out of the camera's range. Black E-Class, moving at consistent speed, not running, not erratic, which was its own kind of information. Niccolo Moretti was driving like a man who'd been told where to go and how long he had to get there. Controlled. Directed. Where does the Bruckner feed into the city from there? Vivian said. Dev had a map open on the secondary monitor. He could take the 3rd Avenue Bridge into the Bronx and come down through Manhattan, or he could continue to the Triborough and cross into Queens or Upper Manhattan. He traced the routes with a finger. If he's heading for a meeting south of Midtown, the Triborough puts him on the FDR, fastest route to Lower Manhattan, Brooklyn, the waterfront. Vivian looked at Marco. Kane's known assets in New York, physical locations, not the shells, the actual operational sites. Marco crossed his arms. We've identified 3 facilities in the last 8 months, a cold storage unit in Greenpoint that we think handles physical asset transfers, a private security company in Sunset Park that's a front for personnel management, and a shipping operation at the Port of New York, the Bayonne Terminal, cross river from Manhattan. He paused. The terminal is the one we've never been able to get close to. Kane keeps that one under very tight control. Vivian looked at the map. The FDR downtown, the bridges to Brooklyn, the water. The terminal, she said. That's where Nicolo is going. You can't know that, Marco said. Kane doesn't meet people in cold storage units, she said. And he doesn't bring the son of Salvatore Moretti anywhere near a personnel front. He brings him somewhere that has controlled access, multiple egress points, and enough legitimate activity to explain away any vehicle traffic at 4 in the morning. She looked at Marco. A working shipping terminal has all three of those things. Marco looked at Salvatore. Salvatore was already looking at Vivian. How long to get there ahead of him? 25 minutes if we move now, she said. Maybe 20. Kane will have people at that terminal, Marco said. We don't know the layout, we don't know the head count, and we don't know what we're walking into. I know, Vivian said. I know exactly what we're walking into. Marco stared at her. Kane described the terminal in enough detail during our call that I could reconstruct the operational layout, she said. He was showing off. He wanted me to understand the scale of what he was offering, which meant he told me things he shouldn't have. She pulled the map toward her and picked up a pen. 3 primary container berths on the western face. Administrative block at the northern end. The access road from the main gate runs parallel to the container yard for approximately 400 meters before it reaches the administrative block, which means any vehicle entering the gate is visible and exposed for the entire approach. She marked it. But there's a secondary maintenance entrance on the eastern perimeter. Kane mentioned the terminal's physical security, but he described it from the inside out, which means his primary concern is what comes from inside, not what comes from outside. The external perimeter will be lighter. Marco looked at the markings. Then he looked at Salvatore. His expression had stopped being doubtful and started being operational. How many can we move in 20 minutes? Salvatore said. 8, Marco said immediately. Maybe 10. I've got 6 in the building right now, and I can pull 4 from the nearest stationary position, which is the Red Hook safe house, 12 minutes away. 8, Salvatore said. Move them now. Sal, Marco started. Now, Marco. Marco moved. Vivian was already folding the marked map. She looked at Salvatore. He was in the process of doing something she had not seen him do in the hours since the courthouse. He was becoming something other than the contained, still version of himself that managed everything at one remove. Something older and more direct was surfacing. She recognized it because she'd seen it once before, years ago, in a basement in Red Hook, when someone had come to that room and told him that a man he'd trusted had gone to a federal agent, and Salvatore had sat with that information for 30 seconds, and then stood up and become, very quietly, something that didn't negotiate. He was becoming that now. You're not coming to that terminal, she said. He looked at her. Don't. You're not coming because if Nicolo sees you, whatever Kane has told him, whatever version of events he's been fed, he's going to run or he's going to shut down, and we lose the ability to use him. She held Salvatore's gaze. You are the one person in this operation who cannot be at that terminal. I need you here, running communications, coordinating with Dev. Marco runs the physical approach. I go with them. You go, Salvatore said flatly. I'm the only one who can talk to Nicolo, she said. Not because he'll trust me. He won't. But because I'm the one person he hasn't been briefed against specifically. Kane prepared him for confrontation with Salvatore, with Marco, with the organization. He didn't prepare him for me because as of 6 hours ago, Kane didn't know where I stood. She paused. I'm a variable Kane didn't account for. That's the only advantage we have, and I need to use it. Salvatore looked at her for a long moment. If something happens to you at that terminal, he said, you understand what I'm telling you. Nothing will happen to me at that terminal, she said, because I'm not going there to fight. I'm going there to think, which is what I'm actually good at, and I need Marco and his people there to handle everything that thinking can't. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he said, Go. The vehicles left the building at 3:48 a.m. 2 cars, dark, unmarked, moving south and then east in the sparse pre-dawn traffic of a city that had not fully gone to sleep but had thinned to its skeleton. Vivian sat in the front passenger seat of the lead car with the marked map on her knee and Marco driving, and she was aware, with the specific clarity that came to her when the variables had been reduced to the ones she could actually control, that what was about to happen was going to be determined by the next 40 minutes, and there was no draft version of the next 40 minutes, only the one that actually occurred. She thought about the terminal layout she'd reconstructed from Kane's inadvertent disclosures. She thought about what Niccolo would know, and what he wouldn't. She thought about the 4 minutes and 11 seconds that Damian Cross had spent on the phone with Niccolo before Kane's man had walked through his door, and what information a frightened intermediary, already understanding that he was being removed from the board, might have transmitted to a man he'd been using as a channel for 18 months. She thought Damian might have tried to warn him, which meant Niccolo might be driving toward the terminal, not because he'd been summoned, but because he'd been warned and hadn't understood what to do with the warning, and the only direction that felt like action was toward the center of the thing rather than away from it. That would make him more dangerous to approach. It would also make him more likely to listen. Marco drove without speaking. She appreciated that about him. He was a man who understood the value of silence inside a moving vehicle when what was inside the vehicle needed to think. They took the secondary approach road that came off the perimeter service route on the eastern side of the port complex, headlights off the last 600 meters, engine noise absorbed by the ambient machinery sound of a terminal that never fully stopped operating. Container yards were never entirely dark or entirely quiet at any hour. Cranes moved in the middle of the night. Logistics trucks pulled in and out of access roads. The whole enterprise maintained a continuous industrial heartbeat that made concealment easier than people imagined. Marco stopped the car at a maintenance gate that was locked but not electronically monitored, and one of his people had it open in 90 seconds, and they moved through on foot in pairs, staying inside the shadows thrown by container stacks that rose 4 and 5 units high on either side, like the walls of a canyon no one had named. Vivian moved behind Marco and ahead of the 2 men assigned to stay close to her, and she moved in the way she'd moved through difficult situations since she was 23 years old. Not hiding from the space, but reading it, letting her eyes adjust and her ears catalog the sound landscape, understanding the geometry of the place by the way sound reflected off the metal surfaces. The administrative block was lit, though sparsely. 2 windows on the ground floor, 1 on the second. The container yard between their position and the administrative block was a grid of alleys formed by stacked units, and the alleys were dark enough to move through without being seen from the lit windows. Then she heard the car. It came through the main gate, not the maintenance entrance, came in with its headlights on, moving at the pace of someone who'd been told to come in, but was not certain of what he was coming into. Black Mercedes E-Class. Vivian recognized it from the camera still on her phone. It stopped in the open area between the container yard and the administrative block, 40 meters from where she was standing in the shadow of a container stack. Niccolo Moretti got out. She'd seen photographs of him. Salvatore kept a framed one on the shelving in his office, a younger version, maybe 8 or 10 years old, but the face was recognizable in the man who stood now in the sodium light of the terminal's overhead lamps. He was 33, dark like his father, but carrying the weight differently. Broader, less contained, with the visible musculature of a man who'd spent years doing physical work alongside the organizational work. He was not his father's stillness. He was kinetic even when he was standing still, energy moving through him sideways, looking for somewhere to go. He looked at the administrative block. He looked at the container yard. He did not look comfortable. He should not have looked comfortable. From the administrative block, a side door opened. 2 men came out, then a third, and the third was not a bodyguard. Victor Kane in person was not what she had assembled from the voice on the phone and the reputation that preceded it. He was 50, perhaps 52, not tall, carrying himself with the compacted weight of a man who had been in difficult physical situations and had understood them to be clarifying. He wore a dark overcoat against the October waterfront cold and moved across the open ground toward Niccolo with the unhurried pace of a man who controlled every second of this encounter and wanted Niccolo to feel that. She was 40 meters away. She could not hear what was said initially. She looked at Marco, who had come up beside her. "How many?" she said, barely above a breath. He held up 4 fingers, then pointed left and right, 2 positions flanking the administrative block, partially visible from where they stood. "I count 2 at the door," she said. "Plus Kane." Plus, however many are inside. Marco nodded. I need 3 minutes with Nicolo, she said. Uninterrupted. Can your people create a distraction on the northern perimeter without triggering a full defensive response? A noise or a light, Marco said. A noise. Something that pulls the flank position's attention north for 90 seconds. Just 90 seconds. 60, Marco said. I can give you 60. Take it. Marco touched the earpiece he was wearing and murmured instructions. She watched the two men at the administrative block door. She watched Kane and Nicolo, close enough now that their body language was readable. Kane speaking in the measured, controlled way she recognized from the phone. Nicolo responding with the tight, clipped movements of someone who was trying to appear less frightened than he was. From the northern end of the terminal, something hit metal. A sharp, resonant impact, the sound a heavy tool makes when it drops on a container surface, loud enough to pull attention, casual enough that it could be the normal operational noise of a working port. Both men at the administrative block door turned north. Kane turned his head fractionally. Vivian moved. She came out of the shadow of the container stack and crossed the open ground at a pace that was fast, but not running, because running would catch peripheral vision, and she needed to reach Nicolo before anyone registered her as a threat. She had 30 meters to cover in the time it took 2 guards to assess a noise and turn back. She covered it in 9 seconds, and she came up behind Nicolo and said his name in a voice calibrated to carry to him and no further. He spun. His right hand moved toward his jacket before he'd even fully processed what he was turning toward, and she put both hands up, palms out, and looked at him straight in the face and said very quietly, I'm Vivian Hawthorne. Your father sent me. Don't reach for what's in your jacket. He froze. His eyes did the rapid calculation that frightened people's eyes do. Threat assessment running in real time, prior information colliding with immediate data, trying to construct a frame for what he was looking at. Vivian. His voice was low, controlled, not as young-sounding as she'd expected. Damien Cross called you at 2:58 this morning, she said. What did he tell you? A muscle in Nicolo's jaw twitched. He said I needed to. The guard at the administrative block door had turned back. He saw her. He shouted. Everything that had been still in the terminal went loud and fast simultaneously. Kane's voice cut through the shouting with a single word in a language she didn't speak, and the 2 guards at the door moved, and from somewhere in the container yard to her right, she heard Marco's people moving, the contained, rapid sound of trained men deploying in a space they'd had 60 seconds to orient to. Vivian grabbed Nicolo's jacket with both hands. With me, she said, and she moved, and he came because the alternative was standing in open ground, and whatever Nicolo Moretti was, he was his father's son in the sense that the instinct to survive was stronger than the instinct to freeze. They went into the container alley to her left, away from the administrative block, into the dark. She could hear behind her, one set of footsteps in pursuit, then Marco's people intersecting that pursuit, the sharp impact of bodies, something hitting the container wall. She pulled Nicolo deeper into the alley. Stop, he said. He pulled back. She let him. He turned her to face him, one hand on her shoulder, not gentle, the pressure of a man who needed to establish something physical before he could process the rest of it. Stop. What the hell is happening? Kane is going to kill you tonight, she said. The same way he killed Damien Cross 3 hours ago. You called Damien at 3 a.m., and Kane's man was in Damien's apartment before 3:10. Damien is dead. You're next. She held his gaze. What did Damien tell you on that call? Nicolo's hand dropped from her shoulder. Something crossed his face, not surprise exactly, but the specific expression of a suspicion confirmed too completely to deny. He said to run, Nicolo said. He said Kane was cleaning house. He said, Nicolo stopped, swallowed. He said if I ran, I had maybe 4 hours. Why did you come here instead of running? She said. Because Kane called me 30 minutes after Damien did, Nicolo said, his voice dropping, and told me that Damien had gone to the FBI, that Damien had fabricated everything and was trying to implicate me as the primary. He said if I came to him, he could protect me. He said he had documentation that would... Nicolo broke off. She watched the moment he heard himself. The moment the 2 calls laid side by side in his own memory, and the structure of the manipulation became visible in a way it hadn't been while it was happening. "He ran the same play twice," she said. "Damien told you to run. Kane told you to come. Kane needed you to come." Nicolo's breathing had changed. "My father," he said. "Your father is in Midtown right now, and he's been trying to reach you for 2 hours," she said. "Your father knows about the Hartford operation. He knows about the access protocol. He knows what you've been channeling to Kane, and he has not written you off, which is why I am standing in this container yard at 4 in the morning instead of letting Kane find you first." She paused. "But Nicolo, I need to know something, and I need you to tell me the truth right now because the next 60 seconds depends on it. The documentation Kane has, the financial records connecting the Moretti organization to his operation, how complete is it?" Nicolo looked at her. His face was very still in the dark, the overhead light from the terminal's operational lamps catching the upper half of it. "Complete," he said. "He has everything. 18 months of transaction records, communication logs, the routing codes, all of it. He built the documentation while we were working together. I thought it was record keeping. It was a case file." His voice was flat with the particular affect of a man who has realized he was outmaneuvered from the first move. "He can hand your father to a federal grand jury on a 48-hour timeline, and there's nothing in the record that would separate Salvatore from the transactions Kane ran through his network." From the other end of the container alley, she heard Marco's voice, tight, directional, calling positions. And then, from the direction of the administrative block, she heard something that changed the physical quality of the air in the terminal. 3 shots. Then a pause. Then 2 more. Then shouting in at least 2 languages. Then silence. Then Marco's voice in her earpiece, which she'd clipped in before leaving the building and had been monitoring throughout. "We have a problem," Marco said. "Kane is not in the administrative block. He was never in the administrative block." His voice was controlled but running hot underneath. "That was a decoy. The man I'm looking at is not Victor Kane." She stood very still. "He knew we were coming," Marco said. "He staged this. The whole approach. Nicolo, the terminal, the lighting, the guards. It was a draw. He pulled us here." She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "Dev?" she said into the earpiece. Dev's voice came back immediately from the monitoring station in Midtown. "Here." Kane was never at the terminal. He used it to pull us out of the building. "What's the status on your external camera feeds, specifically anything covering our current building?" A pause. 4 seconds. 5. "Vivian," Dev said, and his voice had taken on a specific quality. The quality of someone who has just understood something that they did not want to understand. "I'm showing 2 black vehicles stopped on the street outside. They've been there for 11 minutes. I didn't flag them because the building has had stationary vehicles overnight before." "Who's in the building?" she said. "Salvatore," Dev said. "And me." She turned to Nicolo. "Is there anything Kane said to you in the last month about Salvatore directly? Anything specific about what he intended?" Nicolo's face had gone the color of the terminal's concrete. "He said, 3 weeks ago, he said Sal was the last obstacle. He said that once the documentation was complete, once he had everything in place..." Nicolo stopped. "Say it," she said. "He said Salvatore wouldn't be a problem much longer. He said it would look like a decision Sal made himself." Nicolo's jaw tightened. "I thought he meant he was going to use the federal case. I thought he meant..." She was already on the earpiece. "Dev, lock the building. Emergency protocol, all access points." She was moving while she talked, back toward the maintenance entrance, and she heard rather than saw Nicolo moving with her. "Get Salvatore to the interior room on 9. No windows, no external walls. Do it now." "He's not answering the intercom," Dev said. "He went to the roof 20 minutes ago." "The roof." No cover. Full exposure. 11 minutes of stationary vehicles on the street below. "Dev," she said, "call him. His personal cell, right now." She broke into a run. Behind her, she heard Marco relaying information to his people, the clipped language of a man redirecting a force that had been sent the wrong direction and now had to cover ground at speed. She heard Nicolo's footsteps behind her, heavier, keeping up. The maintenance gate was 60 meters ahead. Dev came back in her ear. No answer. Personal cell going to voicemail. She ran. The gate, the car, Marco reaching the driver's door the same second she hit the passenger side, and Niccolo folded himself into the back and Marco had the car moving before the doors were fully closed, lights off, engine pushing hard in the dark, and she gripped the dash with one hand and worked the earpiece with the other. Dev, every camera that covers the roof access stairwell. Tell me what you see. 30 seconds of road noise. Container yard perimeter receding behind them. The approach road, the service route, the main road opening up, Marco running the lights. Stairwell camera is offline, Dev said. She looked at the road ahead and felt something cold and specific settle behind her sternum. Not panic. She'd never been a person who panicked. What she felt was the precise, clarifying sensation of a situation that had just reduced itself to a single point, the way a fire reduces a building. Everything peripheral burned away, only the essential frame remaining. The essential frame was this. Victor Kane had drawn them to the port of New York to empty the building. He had spent 4 hours constructing a scenario designed specifically to move every protective layer away from one target. He had not come for Vivian. He had not come for the documentation. He had come for the one thing that made the Moretti organization function, the one thing that made it cohesive and credible and worth the trouble of neutralizing rather than absorbing. He had come for Salvatore. How far? She said to Marco. 18 minutes, Marco said. She worked the phone, tried Salvatore's cell directly. Voicemail. Tried the building's landline. Ring, ring, ring. Can your people in the building get to the roof? She said. I pulled them all for the terminal, Marco said, his voice carrying the first audible edge of something that was not quite controlled. The building is down to 2. The lobby position and the monitoring station. Tell the lobby position to move to the roof, now. Marco relayed it. Niccolo, in the back seat, said nothing. She could hear his breathing, not panicked, but working, the breathing of someone running a long, difficult calculation against a deadline. He's my father, Niccolo said. Not to anyone specific. I know, she said. I didn't... He stopped. I didn't know what Kane was building toward. I thought it was business. I thought it was a separate arrangement that didn't... He stopped again. That's not an excuse. No, she said. It's not. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. You can say the rest of it to him when we get there. Dev came back in the earpiece. Lobby position is in the elevator. 40 seconds to the roof. She watched the road. 16 minutes of New York City at 4 a.m. between them and the building. Marco was running every amber light and threading the sparse traffic with the precision of a man who'd driven hard in bad situations before. 12 minutes. Dev said, Lobby position is on the roof. She held the earpiece. He's not there, Dev said. The roof is empty. There's no one... A pause. Wait. She gripped the dash. There's a phone on the roof, Dev said. Just sitting on the parapet wall. Another pause. It's Salvatore's. I recognize the case. He's had the same case for 3 years. It's dark green, worn on the left corner. Dev's voice was very careful now. His phone is on the parapet wall. He is not. She said nothing. Vivian, Dev said. The 2 vehicles on the street outside are gone. They left 4 minutes ago. I missed it because I was watching the building cameras, and they left from the north side where my external coverage has a blind spot. Marco made a sound that wasn't a word. 8 minutes to the building, and Salvatore was not on the roof, and his phone was on the parapet wall, and 2 vehicles that had been staging outside for 11 minutes had left 4 minutes ago with a destination she did not yet know. Dev, she said, the documentation Kane built against Salvatore. The federal case file. If Kane hands that to a federal authority right now, tonight, what's the processing timeline before they move? A prepackaged case with that level of documentation. Dev's voice went quiet for a moment. 48 hours. Maybe less if he's already made contact with a specific agent. Is there a federal counterpart who's been running a Moretti investigation? She said. Anything active? 1 moment. Typing. Yes. A financial crimes task force out of the SDNY field office. They've had a working investigation open for 7 months. Lead agent is a woman named Carver, Patricia Carver. Carver. She filed the name. She filed the investigation. She filed the 48-hour timeline. Dev, she said, I need you to pull everything on the SDNY task force's known informant contacts for the last 18 months. Any communication that connects to Kane's known associates, to the logistics coordinator we identified, to anyone in the beneficial ownership chains we traced tonight. That's going to take, you have 7 minutes, she said. We're 7 minutes out. She looked at Marco. He was driving with both hands on the wheel, jaw set, eyes forward. He had the look of a man who was adding numbers in his head and not getting a sum he could live with. The documentation Kane has, she said to Marco. If he uses it, Sal goes to trial on Kane's fabricated record. And Kane gets control of the network without a war, Marco said. Because if Sal is in federal custody, the organization fractures. Different factions move different directions. Kane steps in as the consolidating force. His voice was completely flat. That's the play. Not a hit. A frame. Damien was the frame, she said. He was never the bridge. He was the evidence. The 10 years he spent documenting the architecture I built, the transactions he routed through my protocol, that's the record. That's what Kane hands to Patricia Carver at SDNY. She thought about it for 3 more seconds. Which means the only counter to that record is the original record. The actual architecture, with the construction documentation, the legitimate business basis for every entity, the complete ownership chains going back to origin. You have that, Marco said. I built it, she said. I have everything that shows what the architecture actually is versus what Kane's documentation makes it look like. She paused. But I need Salvatore to walk into that SDNY office himself. Not arrested, not brought in. Voluntarily, with counsel and documentation. He walks in before Kane does, and he hands them a complete picture of what Kane has been running through his network without his knowledge. And he hands them Victor Kane. She looked at Marco. Which is the only play that keeps him out of a cell. He has to walk in himself, Marco said. He has to walk in himself, she confirmed. Which means I need to find him before Kane uses him for something else. The building came into view. Marco pulled to the curb. They went in fast, through the lobby, the elevator, the 10th floor corridor, and she pushed into Salvatore's office, and it was empty, the desk lamp still on, his jacket over the back of the chair, his reading glasses on the open file he'd been working from. She stopped in the center of the room. She looked at the desk, at the file, at what was visible through his reading glasses on the open page. She walked to the desk and looked at the file. It was the transaction summary she'd put in front of him 2 hours ago. The Bergen County acquisition, her handwriting in the margin from when she'd annotated it. But there was something on top of it, resting flat, that had not been there when she'd given it to him. A card. Plain stock, no logo. 3 lines of text, handwritten in a tight, precise script that was not Salvatore's. She picked it up. She read it. She set it down. Marco, she said. He was in the doorway. She turned to face him. Her face told him something because his own face changed in response. Not in its expression, which stayed controlled, but in a small tightening around the eyes that she recognized as the physical response of a man bracing. Kane doesn't want to frame him, she said. That was the contingency. The primary play is simpler. She looked at the card on the desk. He has Salvatore. He's had him since the roof. And he's offering a trade. Marco's voice came out very quiet. What's the trade? She looked at him. Me, she said. In the corridor, she heard Nicolo stop walking. She heard his breath change. The card had 3 lines. The first was an address in Red Hook. The second was a time, 6 a.m., 93 minutes from now. The third line was 8 words. Come alone. Bring the failsafe key. Leave the architecture. He wanted the inner ledger. The core origin records. The complete documentation of 11 years of Moretti financial history. The real version, the one she'd built, with the fail-safe key that would unlock it and make it readable to anyone who held it, friend or enemy, investigator or criminal. He didn't want to frame Salvatore. He wanted the keys to everything Vivian had ever built, and he was using Salvatore to collect them. She stood in the 10th floor office with the card in her hand and the city spreading out beyond the window, the first suggestion of gray beginning somewhere in the east behind the clouds, and she understood with perfect clarity that there was no version of the next 90 minutes that didn't require her to walk into a room where Victor Kane was holding the one person who had come for her when she had nothing, and give him what he was asking for, or find another way. She had been in this building for 6 hours. She looked at the card. She looked at the address. She looked at the time. Then she looked at Marco and said, "Get Dev." She had 89 minutes. She used the first 6 of them standing at Salvatore's desk with the card in her hand, not staring at it, but thinking past it, the way you look through a window rather than at it, when what you need to see is the distance. Dev was in the doorway. Marco was behind him. Niccolo had come in and positioned himself against the far wall with the deliberate unobtrusion of a man who understood he had not yet earned the right to take up space in this room. "He wants the fail-safe key," she said, "which means he understands what the inner ledger contains, and he understands that without the key, it's encrypted in a way that even his best people can't crack." She set the card down, "which means someone told him the fail-safe existed. The only people who knew were in this building tonight." She looked at Dev. "You, Marco, Elise, the 2 technicians." "Elise left at 2 a.m., Dev said. "Routine. She has a medical thing in the morning. She mentioned it before the evening started." Vivian looked at Marco. "She's been with Sal for 14 years, Marco said. His voice was flat in the specific way of a man who does not want to be saying what he's saying. "I'm not saying it was Elise," Vivian said. "I'm saying someone in this building transmitted the information that the failsafe exists and is keyed to me personally. That transmission happened in the last 3 hours. Dev, can you pull internal communication logs for every device that accessed our network between midnight and now?" "Already running it," Dev said. He looked up from his laptop. "Vivian, there's something else." She waited. "Kane's address," Dev said. "The Red Hook location. I ran it." He turned the laptop to face her. "It's a warehouse property. It's registered to a shell entity, 3 layers deep, that I started pulling on 2 hours ago when I was running the offshore structure trace." He paused. "It's one of the nodes in the financial architecture you built. An original Moretti holding that was transferred through a series of transactions 18 months ago into a holding chain that ends at one of Kane's entities." He looked at her. "He's been sitting in your architecture, literally. He found one of your original structures and made it his." She absorbed that. "He's been waiting in a building I built." "For whatever play tonight was supposed to be," Dev said. "Yes." She thought about what it meant that he'd chosen that location for the meeting. It could have been accidental. The building was useful. He controlled it. Red Hook at 6 a.m. was quiet and isolated. But Kane was not a man who did things accidentally. And asking her to come to a building that she had originally designed and that he had subsequently occupied was a message. A specific one. He was telling her what the transfer of the architecture looked like from his perspective. He already lived there. He was already home. She was the one coming to visit. She wasn't going to let that be the frame. "I need 30 minutes, she said. "Marco, I need you and your people positioned in Red Hook before I arrive. Not at the address, around it. There's a loading dock on the south face of every warehouse in that block, and there's a drainage corridor that runs east-west along the back of the building. Can you place people there without them being visible from street-level approaches?" "Yes," Marco said. "Dev, I need you running every camera feed that covers the Red Hook waterfront. I want to see every vehicle, every person, every movement in that area from now until I arrive. If Salvatore is in that building, I need to know where before I walk in." "And if they move him," Dev said, "then you tell me while I'm moving." She looked at Marco. "I need a vehicle that isn't one of ours, something Kane's people won't recognize." "I have a contact in Brooklyn," Marco said. 20 minutes. "You have 15. She looked at Niccolo. Niccolo had not moved from the wall. He had the look of a man who had been very slowly understanding things over the course of a very difficult night, and had arrived somewhere in the last hour at an understanding that was not comfortable but was at least honest. "You can't use me as a visible element," he said. "If Kane's people see me at that location, he'll know the negotiation was never real." "I know," she said. "You're not going to Red Hook." She held his gaze. You're going to the SDNY field office on St. Andrews Plaza. You're going to ask for Special Agent Patricia Carver by name. You're going to tell her you have information regarding a financial crimes operation that involves Victor Kane and that you're prepared to provide voluntary testimony and documentation in exchange for a proffer agreement. Niccolo was quiet for a moment. That's a federal process. I'd need a lawyer. Elise will meet you there, Vivian said. I'll call her on the way. Elise doesn't know. I'll explain what she needs to know. She paused. Niccolo, the documentation Kane built against your father is the weapon he's holding. The only counter-weapon is a voluntary disclosure that gets there first and reframes the entire picture. Your testimony, combined with what I'm going to give Carver from the architecture documentation, is the difference between your father walking out of this and spending the rest of his life in a federal proceeding. She held his gaze the way she'd held it in the container yard, straight, without softening it. You put him in this position. The way out runs through you. Something moved across Niccolo's face. Not drama, something quieter and more lasting. The specific expression of a person accepting the full weight of a consequence without trying to put it down. Okay, he said. One word. She believed it. She called Elise on the way out of the building, explained it in 3 minutes flat. Elise, to her credit, asked exactly 2 clarifying questions and then said she'd be at Street Andrews Plaza in 40 minutes. And Vivian understood why Salvatore had kept her for 14 years. The vehicle Marco produced was a 10-year-old dark blue Volvo that smelled like cigarettes and fast food and was registered to a name that had nothing to do with anyone in the Moretti organization. She drove it herself, which she'd asked for specifically because she needed the drive to Red Hook to be the last piece of preparation, and she needed to prepare alone. It was 4:52 a.m. She drove south and then west through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel approach and down into the waterfront streets of Red Hook, which at this hour was about as close to empty as New York ever got. The wide blocks of the old industrial district, the warehouses that had been many things over many decades and still carried the weight of all of them in their brick faces. The water somewhere beyond the buildings throwing back the orange of the sky that was beginning very hesitantly to shift from black toward the gray that preceded gray-blue, that preceded the idea of morning. She parked 3 blocks from the address. She sat in the car for 4 minutes. She thought about what she was carrying. The fail-safe key existed in her memory. That was the only place it had ever existed, a sequence she had constructed and memorized and never written down, not once, in the years since she'd built it into the inner ledger as insurance on the last day she'd spent in this work before she left it. It was the kind of memory that didn't fade because it had been constructed with the deliberate intention of permanence, a sequence long enough to be uncopyable by accident, but structured in a way that made it retrievable even under stress. She had accessed it mentally twice in the last 5 hours to verify it was intact. It was intact. Kane wanted that sequence. Kane. He believed that if he had it, he had the complete architecture, the origin records, the construction documentation, the full truth of what the Moretti Financial Network actually was versus what he'd made it look like in his fabricated federal case file. What Kane did not know, what no one knew, because she had built the failsafe on her last day and had never told anyone, not even Salvatore, was that the failsafe key did not simply unlock the inner ledger. It also triggered a secondary function that she had embedded into the architecture the same day she'd embedded the failsafe itself, for exactly the reason that she had always understood, at some level, that walking away from what she'd built did not mean it would stop existing without her. And a thing she'd built that could be used against the people she'd built it for was a thing she'd needed an insurance policy on. The secondary function was a full automatic transmission. Every record in the inner ledger, every origin document, every construction file, time-stamped and authenticated, transmitted simultaneously to 3 destinations. A secure federal repository that accepted anonymous financial disclosures. A digital archive maintained by a financial crimes investigative organization. And one other destination that she had chosen 11 years ago with the specific knowledge that if she ever triggered it, there would be no taking it back. Patricia Carver's office at the SDNY field office had a public secure submission portal. Vivian had addressed the transmission to that portal 11 years ago and left it dormant. She had never told Salvatore because telling him would have required explaining that she'd built a dead man's switch into his financial architecture on her way out the door, and she had not been able to explain that in a way that didn't sound like betrayal, even though it wasn't. It was the opposite of betrayal. It was the kind of protection that required keeping the protector's existence secret in order to function. She was going to give Kane the fail-safe key. She was going to walk into that building and hand it to him because she understood what it actually did, and he did not. And that asymmetry was the only real weapon she had. She got out of the Volvo. She walked the 3 blocks. Her earpiece was in. Dev was running. "I have eyes on the building," Dev said. 2 vehicles on the north side, 1 on the south. I count 4 people on external positions, no one on the roof. A pause. "I have a heat signature reading from the ground floor interior, multiple bodies. I'm counting 6, maybe 7. 1 in a position that's separated from the others, stationary, against the east wall." "Salvatore," she said. "Possibly. The signature isn't moving." She reached the building's main entrance, a roll door and a personnel door beside it, the personnel door slightly ajar, which was deliberate, an invitation formatted as carelessness. She pushed it open and went in. The interior of the warehouse was large enough that its far walls were in shadow, even with the work lights that had been set up in the central area. 4 standing lamps forming a rough square of illumination in the middle of the space, the concrete floor between them clear, and outside the illuminated square the dark pressing in from the walls and the high ceiling. The smell was old water and rust and the particular cold of large enclosed spaces that don't heat evenly. Salvatore was against the east wall, seated, not bound, sitting in a chair with 2 men positioned behind him, and the fact that he wasn't bound was its own statement. He was 61 years old, and they had not felt the need to restrain him physically, which meant they were either arrogant or they understood that binding Salvatore Moretti would produce a response that created more problems than it solved. Looking at him across the warehouse floor, she understood it was the latter. He sat straight. He looked at her when she entered without any change in his expression, and what passed between them in that look was not reassurance and not fear, but something simpler: recognition. She was here. He had expected she would be. Victor Kane was standing at the edge of the illuminated square with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. In the warehouse light, he looked different from what she'd imagined during the phone call. Less polished, the Eastern European ancestry more visible in the broad planes of his face, the overcoat doing less work now that the setting was concrete and rust instead of implication. He looked like what he was, a man who had survived very difficult things by being willing to do difficult things, and had arranged those survivals into a career. He looked at Vivian when she stepped into the light. "You came alone," he said. "You knew I would," she said. "I knew you'd come," he said. "Whether alone was a choice I left to you." She stopped at the edge of the illuminated square. "Let him stand up." Kane considered it for a moment. Then he nodded once, and the men behind Salvatore stepped back, and Salvatore stood. He moved carefully. Not injured, she assessed, but stiff from the sitting and the cold. He looked at Vivian, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything. "The key," Kane said. "I want to understand something first," she said. "You don't get to negotiate terms," Kane said. His voice remained smooth, but something underneath it had sharpened. "You're here because I have something you want, and you have something I want. The exchange is simple." "The exchange is simple," she said. "I'm not trying to change the exchange. I want to understand the scope of it before I make it, which is a reasonable thing to want." Kane studied her for a moment. "Ask?" "The federal documentation you built, the case file against Salvatore. If I give you the key, what happens to it?" "It becomes unnecessary," Kane said. "I have no use for a federal case against Salvatore Moretti if I have the architecture. The architecture is the point. The case file is leverage. Once the leverage achieves its purpose, it's retired." "Retired," she said. "You'd need to give me something more durable than a word on that." "You're in no position to require durability," Kane said. "I'm in the only position that matters," she said. "I'm the position that has the key. Which means if you want what I have, you give me what I need to believe the exchange is real." She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to dissolve the file. I'm asking you to tell me where it is. Physical location. If the file exists somewhere I can verify it, somewhere that confirms it hasn't already been transmitted to Carver's office, then I'll believe the transaction is real. Kane was quiet. She watched him think, the slight movement behind his eyes of a man calculating whether this was a trap or a legitimate request from a woman who needed reassurance to complete an exchange she had no other choice but to complete. The documentation exists on a private server, he said, finally. The server is maintained at a facility in New Jersey. It has not been transmitted anywhere. It won't be transmitted as long as the arrangement we're making tonight holds. She absorbed that. New Jersey. Dev was listening. And the arrangement, she said. You give me the key. You walk out with Salvatore. The Moretti organization transitions its remaining operations into structures I designate over the next 18 months. Without interference. Salvatore retires in practice. Whatever his title remains in name. You come and work for me, not under duress, because you're too good to spend your life managing a declining family operation when you could be building something that actually matches your capabilities. He looked at her with something that was almost direct. I've meant that offer genuinely every time I've made it. I know, she said. She did know. That was the unsettling thing about Victor Kane. The offer was genuine. The appreciation was genuine. He had spent 3 years engineering a scenario that would end with Vivian Hawthorne sitting across from him as an asset, not because she was the only tool available, but because she was the best one. And men like Kane did not acquire best-in-category assets by coercion when they could acquire them by making the coercion feel like a choice. She looked at Salvatore. He was watching her with the same still attention he'd had in every room they'd been in together tonight, and in the rooms they'd been in together 11 years ago. And she understood something about that attention that she hadn't fully articulated to herself until this moment. It was not the attention of a man waiting to see what she would do. It was the attention of a man who already knew and was watching her arrive at it herself, because he'd understood who she was since she was 23 years old, and that understanding had never required her to perform it, only to inhabit it. She looked back at Kane. The key is a sequence, she said. 37 characters. You'll need to write it down. She paused. Do you have something to write with? Kane reached into his coat, produced a pen, looked around, found a flat surface, a crate at the edge of the lit square, and stood ready. She recited the sequence, all 37 characters, clearly and without hesitation, because she had memorized it with the intention of reciting it under exactly this kind of pressure. Kane wrote it down. He looked at it. He produced a phone, photographed it, sent it somewhere. She tracked the motion of his thumb on the screen and understood he was sending it to a technical contact who would verify it against the ledger's access protocol. They waited. 40 seconds. Kane's phone produced a notification. He read it. Something in his face changed. Not expression, exactly, but the small, involuntary shift of a man receiving confirmation. It works, he said. Of course it works, she said. And then she felt it. The transmission. Not literally, not as a physical sensation, but as the awareness of having crossed a threshold that she'd built 11 years ago and always known was there. The secondary function embedded in the failsafe. The automatic transmission triggered by the key's activation. Everything in the inner ledger, everything in the origin records, everything in the construction documentation, moving through encrypted channels right now toward 3 destinations, toward the Federal Repository, toward the archive, toward Patricia Carver's secure submission portal at the SDNY field office. Not because she'd pressed a button, because she'd given Kane the key. He had triggered it himself. She stood in the warehouse light and let that sit for a moment. We're done, she said. I'd like to leave. Kane studied her. Something had shifted in his assessment. She could see it, the slight recalibration of a man who had gotten what he wanted and was now checking whether what he'd gotten was what he'd thought it was. That was straightforward, he said, for someone of your reputation. I'm tired, she said. It's been a long night. She walked to where Salvatore was standing. He fell into step beside her without being told, and they walked toward the personnel door, and none of Kane's people moved to stop them, because the transaction had been completed, and Kane was a man who kept the terms of transactions that had gone his way. She pushed through the personnel door. The cold of the Red Hook waterfront hit her face. The sky was gray-blue now, the first honest light of morning pressing up from the horizon in the east over the water, and she stood on the concrete apron outside the warehouse and breathed. Salvatore came out beside her. He stood without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "You gave him the key." "I gave him the key," she said. He was quiet. She heard in the quality of that quiet that he was deciding whether to ask the question he was already formulating. "What did the key do?" he said. "It unlocked the ledger," she said, "and it sent everything in the ledger to the Federal Financial Crimes Repository, the Independent Archive, and Patricia Carver's secure submission inbox at SDNY. She paused. "Along with a complete annotated record of what each item in the ledger actually represents, in language that a federal prosecutor can read, that distinguishes your organization's legitimate financial history from the transactions Kane routed through it without your knowledge." Salvatore stood with that. "You built that into it," he said, 11 years ago. "On my last day," she said, "before I walked out." He was very quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. "You protected it," he said, "on your way out." "I built it," she said. "I was always going to protect it." She heard a car on the street to the north. Marco, she knew it from the engine note, positioned precisely where she'd asked him to be. She heard in her earpiece Dev saying her name, and she said, "I'm out, Sal is out, we're on the south face," and heard the exhale Dev made in response. "Kane's going to know within the hour," Salvatore said. "Sooner," she said. "His technical contact will try to access the ledger through the key and find that the inner layer has been replaced by a federal seizure notice. The transmission went to Carver's office with authentication codes that allow SDNY to freeze the server in New Jersey." She looked at the sky. "The case file he built against you is on a server that Carver now has the authentication to access and seize. His leverage dies with the server." Salvatore looked at her. "And the server address," he said slowly. "He told you." "He told me it was in New Jersey." Dev found the specific facility from the network signature on the transmission Kane sent his technical contact. "Dev passed it to Carver's office 4 minutes ago." She paused. "Nicolo is at St. Andrew's Plaza with Elise right now providing voluntary testimony. By the time Carver's people reach the server, they'll have Nicolo's corroboration and my architectural documentation and an anonymous federal disclosure that came in through the secure portal 40 minutes ago." She looked at him. "Kane has nothing. He traded his leverage for a key that emptied his hands." Salvatore stood in the early morning light of the Red Hook waterfront, and she watched something move through him. Not relief, which would have been too simple and too clean. Something more complex than that. The expression of a man who has been shown that the protection he'd been given was deeper than he'd known, and the debt that implied was something he wasn't sure how to hold. "Vivian," he said. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly. He nodded. He looked at the water. Marco pulled up. Ed. 3 weeks later, Dev tracked Victor Kane to the transit terminal at JFK, attempting to board a private charter under a secondary passport. Federal agents from the SDNY task force were already waiting at the gate. Carver had been building toward the arrest for 2 weeks, using the architectural documentation and the server seizure and Nicolo's testimony to construct the most complete financial crimes case her office had assembled in a decade. Kane was taken without incident, which she'd been told later was unusual for men of his particular history, and which she privately attributed to the fact that he'd already understood, somewhere between Red Hook and JFK, that the architecture had been designed to close around him, and he'd walked into it himself. The federal case named 47 counts across financial fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and related charges. The evidence was, in the language of Carver's public statement, comprehensive. Nicolo Moretti cooperated fully under the terms of the proffer agreement. He received a reduced sentence in a separate proceeding, 18 months suspended with 3 years of supervised release and a permanent prohibition from organizational involvement. Salvatore accepted the terms on his son's behalf without argument and without, as far as anyone could observe, any visible collapse of the relationship between them. What happened in private was their own business. The Moretti organization, as such, began a structured winding down of its remaining criminal operations over the following months, under the supervision of Elise and a compliance firm she engaged. The legitimate holdings, the real estate, the logistics company, the lending operation, remained intact, transitioned formally into above-board structures with clean ownership chains. They were profitable. They had always been profitable. The legitimate side had always been real. Damian Cross's death was ruled a homicide. The investigation connected it, eventually, to Kane's organization through evidence that the federal case had made available. The file was closed before Vivian had to be called to testify on anything relating to her marriage, which was the outcome she had calculated and the outcome she had worked to produce, and she was not sentimental about having worked for it. What she was, in the weeks after, was tired in a way that surprised her. Not the productive exhaustion of the night in the building when she'd run on adrenaline and calculation and the clean urgency of a problem with a defined solution. Something longer and heavier than that. The particular weariness of someone who has been in a posture of defense for so long that when the defense is finally unnecessary, the body doesn't know what to do with itself. She slept 10 hours 2 nights in a row, which was something she hadn't done since before the marriage. Maybe before the work. Maybe since she was 22 years old and still a version of herself who didn't understand yet what she was capable of or what it would cost. She sold the apartment, the one she and Damian had shared on the Upper West Side, the one she hadn't lived in for the last 14 months of the marriage because she'd been sleeping in a guest room and pretending not to know why. She sold it in the first week, below asking, to a family who had 3 children and needed the space. And she did not go back to collect anything because there was nothing there that belonged to the person she currently was. The house in Connecticut, the one Damian had purchased in the 4th year of their marriage, the one with the fieldstone exterior and the kitchen with the eastern exposure that she had genuinely loved before she had stopped being able to love anything in a space that had been arranged by Damian's choices. She bought from the estate at the price set by the executor, which was less than its market value because the circumstances of the seller's death made certain buyers uncomfortable, and she was not uncomfortable. She drove up on a Saturday in November with no specific plan, walked through the empty rooms, stood in the kitchen with the eastern exposure, and looked at what remained of the life she'd assembled in the decade she'd been trying to be someone she wasn't. She stood there for an hour. Then she made 2 phone calls. The first was to a contractor. The second was to a parks foundation she'd identified, which accepted land donations for public green space projects in underserved communities. By April the following year, the house was gone. The fieldstone exterior, the kitchen, the guest room she'd slept in, all of it cleared and the land prepped and donated, and by the following summer there were children running across it on a Tuesday afternoon while she drove past on her way somewhere else. And she didn't stop, but she looked through the window and she thought that was right. That was the correct use of the ground. She rented a floor-through apartment in a building in Brooklyn Heights that had high ceilings and a view of the water and no history she was responsible for. She furnished it slowly, in pieces she chose herself. A desk that was wide enough to work at seriously, chairs that were comfortable without being soft, a kitchen that she stocked with the ingredients of someone who actually intended to cook, which she did, badly at first and then with increasing competence, because learning to do a thing from scratch turned out to be easier when you had already proven to yourself that you could learn anything from scratch. She worked. The work was different from what it had been before. The Moretti organization's legitimate holdings were in a transition period that required exactly the kind of structural thinking she'd spent her career doing, but without the architecture of concealment, which was simpler in some ways and more demanding in others, because the constraints of legitimacy are different from the constraints of invisibility, and she had to relearn the territory. She found she preferred it. Not for moral reasons, or not only say it. She preferred it because the thing she'd always been best at was building structures that were solid, that held their weight, that didn't collapse when examined, and legitimate structures could be examined openly, which meant the quality of the work was legible in a way it had never been before. She had dinner with Salvatore on the 3rd Thursday of every month. They had been doing it since November when he'd shown up at her Brooklyn apartment with a bottle of wine she hadn't asked him to bring, and the demeanor of a man who was going to have dinner with someone, whether or not they'd formally agreed to it. She had let him in. She had cooked badly, which he had eaten without comment. They had talked about the organization's transition and about the legitimate holdings and about the legal proceedings and sometimes about other things, books, occasionally, or the neighborhoods of the city as they'd been at different points in both their lives, or nothing at all, sitting on opposite sides of the table with the window behind him showing the water and the silence between them being the comfortable kind, the kind that accumulates between people who have been through something real together and don't need to fill it. He did not apologize for what his organization had been. She did not ask him to. That was not what the dinners were. What the dinners were was what came after. She did not miss Damien. She had expected to miss some version of him. Not the man she now knew he'd been, but some ghost of what she'd believed for the years when she hadn't known. The version she'd constructed from incomplete information. That ghost had not materialized. What she found when she looked for it was not grief, but something closer to the feeling of putting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was a weight. The incremental lightness of a body that has been allowed to stand straight again and is still learning what that posture feels like. She thought about Catherine Reeves occasionally, the widow in Terrytown with the dormant key who had held something for years without fully understanding what she was holding or what would happen when she used it. She thought about the way complicity worked, not dramatically, not in a single moment of choice, but in the accumulation of small agreements with things you didn't look at directly, until the looking away had become structural, had become part of how you moved through the world without realizing you'd made it permanent. She had done that herself. Not the same way, not with the same knowledge or ignorance, but in the fundamental sense of having agreed, incrementally, to be less than what she was, and having called that agreement love, or safety, or peace, when it was none of those things and she had known it wasn't, and had continued anyway because the alternative required her to be the person she'd been trying to stop being, and she hadn't been ready to be her again yet. She was ready now. On a Tuesday in March, she was at her desk when her phone showed a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it on the third ring, because she always answered calls she didn't recognize now, because she had learned in a single long night that unknown numbers could be the thing that changed everything, and she was no longer a person who let fear of change decide which calls she took. It was Patricia Carver, not calling about the case, which was in the pretrial phase and moving steadily. Calling because Carver's office was establishing an advisory relationship with a small number of financial architecture specialists who could help them understand complex criminal structures without relying entirely on institutional resources that were sometimes a generation behind the methods they were trying to prosecute. "I'd like to meet," Carver said, informally, "to see if there's a way to make this useful for both of us." Vivian looked out the window at the water, at the March light on it, which was still winter light but had begun, in the last week, to carry the specific quality of approaching spring. Thinner, cleaner, the particular kind of light that showed things exactly as they were without the softening of summer haze or the flattening of winter gray. "I can do Thursday," she said. She hung up and sat for a moment. Then she opened the document she'd been working on before the call. The structural analysis of the logistics company's Eastern Corridor expansion. A 40-page working document that was 3 weeks from being as complete as she could make it. She found her place. She read the last paragraph she'd written. She picked up where she'd left off. Outside the window, the water did what water does. Moved without urgency or performance, indifferent to being observed, simply itself in the light of the morning. She worked at her desk, and the apartment was quiet around her, and the city was doing all the things cities do outside her window, and none of it required her to be anything other than the person she actually was. That was the thing she'd spent 11 years forgetting and one long night remembering. It did not resolve dramatically. It did not arrive all at once, in a single clean moment of reclamation. It came back the way things that have been genuinely yours always come back. Not with announcement, but with the quiet persistence of something that belongs to you and always has, and was never, despite everything, actually gone. She worked until evening. When she stopped, she sat for a moment with her hands on the desk and looked at what she'd built. Not the document, which was a document, but the accumulating evidence of a person in the process of constructing something real. The desk itself, the apartment, the Thursday dinners, the phone call she'd just answered, and the meeting she'd just agreed to. The legitimate structures she was helping make solid. the things that would hold their weight when examined. She had walked out of a courthouse in the rain with nothing. She had believed for approximately 4 minutes that nothing was the correct assessment. She had been wrong. She turned off the desk lamp. She stood up. She went to the kitchen and started making dinner, badly, the way you make things when you're still learning, and the window over the sink showed her the water going dark in the last of the evening light. And she stood there in her own kitchen, in her own apartment, in her own life, and cooked. And the silence around her was not the silence of a woman waiting to be allowed to take up space. It was the silence of a woman who had already decided.